A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I'm not proud of what I did that night, and as I sit here, blankets pulled tightly around me in this dimly lit room, the weight of my actions weighs heavy on my chest, suffocating me with each breath. It started when I decided to take a walk after a long week, the kind of stroll meant to clear your head but only led me deeper into the labyrinth of my own thoughts, contemplating my dreary existence as I passed by flickering streetlights. That's when I saw her, huddled near an alleyway, her long hair tangled and matted, skin pale and hollowed, yet there was a raw beauty about the girl, probably barely 20, with eyes that seemed to flicker with a hint of life despite her circumstance. Her name was Kelly, and though her clothes were ragged and her body trembled from the cold, she somehow managed to smile at me with a warmth that shocked my conscience back to life. I stopped, heart racing, curiosity battling the moral lessons ingrained in me, and before I knew it, I was engaged in a conversation with her, her soft voice contrasting sharply with the harsh edge of her world. She recounted stories of loss, betrayal, and the harsh realities of surviving on the streets, eliciting a strange mix of admiration and pity in me, and as I spoke to her, sharing tales of my own mundane struggles, I felt an absurd connection to this girl who had nothing. Somewhere in the bleakness of that alley, between the verses of her sad life, I found myself becoming enchanted, my heart racing under the illusion of a twisted romance, as we laughed and shared secrets unfit for our surroundings. I was lost in the moment as her hand grazed mine, and despite the growing ache of conscience, a darker urge began to bubble within. She leaned closer, and the space between us crackled with an electric tension. She said she needed help, and in an impulsive moment of weakness, I made a string of terrible decisions that led us to my car parked a few blocks down. The cramped space became charged, her presence overwhelming, the smell of stale cigarettes and unwashed clothes mixed with something raw and primal in the air. I could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, but the urgency of the moment drowned it out as she leaned in, whispering softly, and I could feel the allure of my desires clash violently with my ethics. As I surrendered to the primal instinct feeding the shadowy depths of my mind, I suddenly became hyper-aware of the risk, the fleeting thrill of the taboo feeling exhilarating, intoxicating, dangerously inviting. One moment, I was just a man, and the next, I had been reborn into something darker as she knelt before me, and I was helpless against the allure of the situation. There, in the confinement of my car, morality and reality blurred, tugging at my chest as I lost myself in the forbidden act, revulsion battling with exhilaration, leaving a taste so bitter and sweet it nearly consumed me whole. And yet, as the might of shame washed over me afterward like a tidal wave, I realized the girl was simply a fragment of my own delusions, a vessel to challenge my values, and I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that I had done more than just indulge in a moment of weakness. I had violated the very humanity I claimed to uphold. After it was over, her eyes held something I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of gratitude for the fleeting escape I had given her and a deeper sorrow for the life she had led and a life she knew would not allow her a better end. She slipped out of my car like a ghost, her silhouette merging into the shadows of the streets, and I was left staring at the vacant passenger seat, my blood still raging against the fraying edges of my morality, paralyzed by the haunting vision of her now faded smile and the whispered implications of my choices. I drove home in a daze, the streets transformed into a blur of red lights and darkened corners where I imagined other souls may be lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to ensnare those naive enough to cross their paths. Now, the silence of my room has been shattered by the chorus of my mistakes echoing in my mind, and I can't stop replaying that night like a broken record, the details sharp and clear, her laughter, her touch, the focus of my desires, the contemplation of a life I will never fully understand. I know that I should feel no remorse in the darkness, that somewhere she was still out there, yet the shadows cast by my actions loom larger than life, breeding something ugly in the fertile soil of my regret. The girl I almost saved has transformed into a specter who haunts my conscience, feeding a gnawing dread that leaves me reeling in guilt, wanting to seek redemption but fearing that the real horror might lie waiting in the alleyways, mirrored back at me in the faces of all those I ignore every day. Now, as I sit here, trembling with the weight of my decisions, I can't help but wonder if after that night, I still have the right to look anyone in their eyes, or if I've become the reflection of all that I despise, a thoughtless monster lurking beneath the surface, masked by the guise of a moral man, driven by instincts I thought had long been buried but now dance menacingly just out of reach. I never imagined my day would spiral into a nightmare just because I forgot to lock my bathroom door. The chain of events started innocently enough when I left my apartment for the first time in weeks, both anxious and excited to find the right real estate agent to help me sell my place. I'd gone through a rough patch recently, loss of my job, and subsequently, a deep financial hole I needed to crawl out of, and the idea of leaving my little sanctuary after years of solitude sent a tingle of dread down my spine, so I promised myself I'd be careful. After a morning researching agents online, I scheduled an appointment with Sarah, a promising young real estate agent known for her thrilling social media posts and an impressive list of recent sales. I met her in the lobby of my building, her blonde hair perfectly slicked back, a professional demeanor cloaking what I guessed was a truly vibrant personality. She reassured me that everything was going to be okay as she ushered me into my apartment, but I felt an undercurrent of anxiety when it hit me. I hadn't tidied up after my frantic week of hibernation. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of stale air greeted me while remnants of my last meal lay unwashed, scattered in the sink. I motioned for her to start, but I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. The pent-up dread weighed heavily, making my skin crawl with self-awareness. Sarah seemed unfazed, though, and began discussing the potential of my living space. Her client, a young couple who had just begun peering down the hallway from 2 floors up, wrapped in with anticipation outside the door, and I could sense that future buyers were gathering intrigued in their minds. I turned to pour myself a glass of water but was interrupted by a sudden commotion. My bathroom door swung wide open, and before I realized it, I was standing completely naked behind a half-open door that separated my shared space from my hidden refuge. The couple, whom I'd only seen on videos scrolling through social media, gasped in disbelief, but only momentarily. Their shock turned to bewilderment before they averted their eyes, laughter echoing off faux wood floors as I bolted to cover my nakedness, grabbing a nearby throw blanket in a panic. Sarah's face twisted between shock and humor as she quickly ushered them out after the initial surprise wore off, and all I could hear as I stood there trembling was the sound of my own heartbeat thrumming loudly against my eardrums as I debated whether I should just disappear into the ground right then and there. Everything about that moment felt surreal, as I felt like I had turned into some absurd character in a sitcom wrongfully scripted to reflect my real-life embarrassment. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, pacing my apartment like a trapped animal, consumed by shame. But it didn't stop there. As Sarah returned, the glint in her eyes suggested something uncomfortably thrilling had occurred, a spark of excitement from unfolding drama. I avoided her gaze, but she seemed to sense my vulnerability, telling me that it happened more often than I might think, in a world that pushed the boundaries of personal space, where privacy had become an elusive concept. But there was something more unsettling in her tone, a hint of amusement that made my skin prickle again. And I couldn't shake the feeling that being forgotten was the least of my concerns because in the haze of my humiliation, something sinister lurked in the back of my mind. Days turned into weeks, and somehow, I figured that everyone had probably forgotten about the disastrous walk-in, but then late one night, I heard something odd, faint thumping against my apartment door that reverberated through the walls, an uncomfortable reminder of all that had transpired. I opened the door cautiously, only to find a crumpled note wedged into the doorway, penned in an aggressive yet familiar scrawl, "We aren't done yet." It rattled me to my core, the chill crawling down my spine intensifying as I reflected back on the enigma that enveloped Sarah and the couple. I hadn't thought twice about the whispers I heard trailing behind them during our next exchanges, but clearly, I hadn't considered someone might be keeping tabs on my every move. Was I being targeted for failure, or was it just a sick joke strung along from that embarrassing moment? The anxiety curled in my gut until all the warmth I'd yearned for grew cold in a heartbeat, and it spiraled into a toxic mess of paranoia. As I lay in bed that night, shadows danced against the wall, and every creak of the building's settled sound weighed down heavy on my soul. I thought of Sarah, how long she'd been waiting in that hallway, smirking and waiting for me to unravel before her surprise guests. Under cover of night, I fell asleep with the covers pulled tight, battling my heavy eyelids. Dreams morphed into images of unfamiliar faces and playful laughter. What started as mockery but grew into something darker. One evening, after days of hearing unexplainable sounds and footsteps I swore echoed into my walls, I shoved my sleep-deprived body out of bed, desperately clutching my phone's flashlight. I tried dismissing the chill lingering in my gut, crafting rational explanations as I crept toward each room. But then everything froze. The silhouette of a figure cloaked in the darkness was waiting for me, the shadows lying just behind where the faint moonlight spilled across the living room floor. It didn't look like Sarah, nor did it resemble anyone I had ever met, but there stood someone unfurling that day's events once more like an outlined tragedy of life. The weight of my shame returned tenfold, but the horror of being watched, truly watched, consumed me, drowning me in a surreal fear that felt more human than I'd known. They whispered my name, yet their voice was all wrong, twisted like they'd been remolded by rejection, feasting off my vulnerability in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I stood rooted in place as their breath curled through the air, carrying with it the fragrance of danger, and in that lingering moment, I realized the seamless facade of my life had cracked wide open, leaving me exposed to a strange combination of hostility and amusement, and suddenly I was buoyed by the horrifying truth: some stories don't end when we want them to, but rather stretch like an unwelcome guest haunting shadows, willing to reappear right when the light fades away. For the past year, I've learned to navigate the dizzying labyrinth of office politics with the finesse of a cat burglar. I have perfected the ability to blend into the beige walls of cubicles, relying on a carefully curated facade that keeps my coworkers oblivious to the fact that I have been barely working, to the point where my job feels like a ghost haunting me, something I can just barely see in the dim light of the fluorescent bulbs. You see, it all started with a quiet realization: nobody really watches over anyone anymore, not in this post-pandemic world where remote work and hybrid schedules have blurred the lines between effort and apathy. It was just a subtle shift in how we operated: fewer meetings, fewer eyes on screens at 9 a.m. I discovered a groove where emails and reports, once my daily burden, became an afterthought, a mere whimsical notion. I found myself participating in the endless Zoom calls, muted and resting my camera on the ceiling fan, while I perused various conspiracy theories online, skillfully responding with just enough jargon to appear engaged, tossing out half-cocked ideas that always seemed to hit the mark, until I became a ghost of productivity. My colleagues praised my so-called insight, and with each passing month, it filled me with an odd mix of unease and elation, as I watched how easily they bought into my charade. As the year dragged on, I could feel the weight of complacency settle like dust on the shelves of my soul. Though part of me felt guilty, I relished the growing ease of my life. Yet, something buried beneath complacency began to gnaw at my insides, a growing sense of dread that perhaps this blissful neglect could not last forever. I would occasionally glance out of the slatted blinds towards the gray sky, half expecting some sort of divine revelation or swift punishment for my sloth, but instead, the world continued on without skipping a beat. Then, things started getting a little strange when I began receiving anonymous emails filled with cryptic messages, black scripts that hinted at my careless situation. At first, I dismissed them as pranks by disgruntled coworkers, perhaps those who could smell the stagnation whirling around me like invisible smoke. But my idle imagination spiraled. The emails grew darker, more accusatory, their tone shifting from playful to menacing. "You're being watched," the last one read, with no signature, just a screenshot of my own disinterested face taken during one of those Zoom meetings where I thought myself invisible. It shook my ability to remain complacent, awakening a horrid curiosity, spurring me into action. Late at night, in the flickering glow of my laptop, as I navigated the murky back alleys of my IT department's files, something in my stomach churned violently. I uncovered data logs, revealing that someone had been tracking me, mapping my digital footprints through company servers. The realization spiraled into a frenzy, as shadows grew long around my desk. I need to defend myself, but how? Doubts plagued my thoughts. I was no longer simply avoiding work, I was now at war with an unseen adversary, one whose motives I couldn't begin to fathom. Anxiety turned my coffee blacker, my heart raced as I thought about unraveling the threads of my deceit, only to find myself confronting whoever lay behind the screen. And then the night came when cowardice finally left my side, propelling me to meet the mystery head-on. The office would be empty, I determined, a perfect stage for whatever power game was being played unbeknownst to me. Armed with my laptop and a rickety resolve, I entered the gray cube at midnight, illuminated by the glow of stale light. It only took a few clicks to discover a file hidden deep within the core of our company network, labeled Project Watcher. Its contents were incomprehensible, data after data, detailing not just my inactivity but those of others who, unbeknownst to me, had also sidled into sloth. This wasn't merely some prank, it was predation. Suddenly, the silence of the night shattered with the creaking of the office door, and I froze in terror. A figure slipped through, cloaked in shadows, their face obscured but their presence unmistakably malicious, and my heart thundered in uncertainty and fear as I realized this was no corporate overlord stand-in, but the embodiment of my guilt that I had so skillfully avoided, a fierce reminder that negligence has a way of manifesting into something corporeal. They approached my desk with an eerie calmness, and I could only watch in horror as their gloved hand reached out towards my screen, filling my mind with thoughts of confrontation and justification. "You wanted to get away with nothing, didn't you?" Their voice hissed, equal parts eerie and firm, and in that moment, I knew that indeed I was no longer simply battling for my job. This was a reckoning, a physical manifestation of every late report, every unnoticed absence, eyes that had finally opened to the shame of laziness I had embraced all too willingly. I stumbled back in disbelief as the figure loomed closer, and the lights flickered ominously, the very air thickened with the tension of inevitability. "It's time to put in some real work, don't you think?" they purred, and in an instant, the world broke open, exposing the far reaches of my negligence. I could hear the cacophony of hushed whispers echoing off the walls, the harsh judgment of those I'd wronged, their eyes piercing my stunted resolve, pinning me to the very essence of accountability. I realized that this act of subterfuge had consequences. Nobody leaves the stage without a price to pay. I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat, my laptop beside me, closed, yet the weight of the dream remained heavy, a lingering attachment that branded me. The office moved on as if nothing had happened. I played my part, expertly feigning normalcy, but now I hold the secret of that night, the knowledge that every action has an echo, a lingering trace that cannot be unmade. And when the whispers began again, slowly gathering intensity, I decided I would no longer be the ghost in the office, hiding in plain sight. I would seize control of my fate. Yet as I took a couple of steps into my workspace, I couldn't shake off the feeling that those watching weren't through with me yet. The tendrils of fear resurfaced, vibrating beneath my skin, a quiet reminder that indeed, once you embrace apathy, it may just embrace you back in ways you never saw coming. I never intended to steal from Taco Bell, it just kind of happened, a spiral into something I couldn't control and, to be honest, didn't want to. I was 22, fresh out of college, drowning in debt, and desperately trying to navigate a world that felt decided to sucker punch me with every twist and turn. It all started the day I walked into the brightly lit Bell, the familiar smell of seasoned beef and melted cheese flooding my senses. I was there to get my usual, but as I waited at the counter, my eyes drifted to the open kitchen. The employees moved like clockwork, a flurry of activity, laughter, and the occasional shout overshadowed by the hum of the fryer. It was that moment I noticed the employee in the back, filling an oversized bag with quesadilla slices, throwing in handfuls of tortillas as if they had just realized they were giving away treasure. And in that moment of weakness, my brain switched to survival mode. I had just entered the world of free food chaos, and the exhilarating rush of adrenaline cascaded through me. I started small, slipping nachos and soft tacos into my backpack, the thrill sending electric jolts down my spine as I made my way to the safety of the parking lot. There was a kind of madness in it, a freedom, and with every successful theft, I devised bigger plans. Over the weeks, I learned the schedules of the staff, their shifts, the times when the manager would step out for a smoke, leaving the back exposed and unguarded. I developed a routine. I'd swing by Taco Bell during the late night shifts, the foggy breath of my breath visible in the cold air. While they were distracted with customers, I'd ease the heavy back door open, and it was like slipping into an alternate reality. Inside the glorious kitchen, I'd fill my backpack with stolen burritos, packets of hot sauce, and still warm churros, reveling in the thrill of stealing what I had never known I wanted so desperately. I justified it to myself, telling myself I was saving money, beating the odds. But deep down, I sensed a darkness creeping in, an insatiable hunger to take more and more until I felt like I owned that fast food kingdom, like I could control it all rather than just scraping by. I could practically taste the fear I had instilled in the employees. I was the phantom that snatched food from under their noses, the invisible hand siphoning their labor. As the months passed, I became careless, brazen. I was addicted to the rush, and one inevitable night, the doors that had once been my gateway to culinary bliss turned into a trap. I hadn't realized they had installed new cameras, tiny, circular spy eyes watching every move with a relentless hunger, and that evening, the tension in the air crackled like static. The busy peaks of the late-night drive-thru were replaced with the dreadful silence of anticipation, and as I slipped through the door on autopilot, my heart dropped when I noticed a figure waiting just inside the shadows, standing impossibly still with an unsettling grin painted across his face. He wore the Taco Bell uniform, cap tilted forward just enough to hide his eyes, but I saw the glint of something metallic in his hands. He stepped forward, revealing a badge that shone ominously in the fluorescent lights. "I'm with the management, and I know all about you." My breath caught in my throat as reality rushed back in. The time for playful thievery was over. I was cornered. I stumbled back, grappling with guilt and despair, realizing I had gone too far. He chuckled softly, his voice dripping with a mix of amusement and menace. "You think it's just about food? Look around." I glanced towards the employees, who now watched me with an electrifying mix of confusion and fear. Suddenly, everything that I thought was a victimless crime was charging back at me, and I felt the weight of my actions crashing down. They knew, and they were ready to turn a blind eye, but not out of kindness, out of something darker. As the manager gestured for me to step closer, dread clawed at my insides. I didn't just steal tacos, I realized. I had stolen an identity, fabricated a horrifying connection with a place I had once loved. The walls around me began to close in, and with it dawned a sense of primal dread. I would leave this store empty-handed, but not in the way I had thought. My reputation, my future, everything I had wrapped up in fast food dreams shattered in a heartbeat. I was no longer the hidden thief, I was now the hunted. The rush of the last few months turned to ice in my veins. I turned to run, dodging the horrified glances of employees who whispered among themselves, unsure of what to think of this violation of trust. I pushed the door open, crashing into the cold night air, heart hammering in my chest, and as I sprinted into the darkness, I could hear the unmistakable sound of a walkie-talkie crackling to life behind me, the voice cold and indisputable. "We have a code red, the thief is on the loose." I never went back to Taco Bell, not because of any regrets but out of the looming presence of shadows that seemed to follow me into every corner as if they were eternal reminders of the boundary I had crossed. The temptation of my former thefts echoes in my mind. Can't help but wonder what else I could have taken from them if I just reached back for one last bite of their nightly drive-thru. What haunted me most wasn't the fear of the police showing up at my door or the embarrassment of being caught. It was the chilling thought that perhaps they weren't just guarding food, but something darker, something they had a lot more to protect than just their tacos. Now, I can't enter a Taco Bell without feeling the eyes of my past glaring back at me, a mark of shame in the grease-stained shadows of their kitchen, forever haunted by the meals I stole, and the name I carved into their walls, a name they call out from every sleeping town across America, a name that, if whispered just right, still echoes back. To me, the thief they never really caught.
When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bonds shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. "Ida," I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. "I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive." My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. "What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings," I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. Ida for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. 1 minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "You should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me: every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened. I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. See you soon. I never found Laura. The police still refuse to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, Ida for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought a simple time test could spiral into a living nightmare, but here we are, and I need to share what happened before it consumes me entirely. My husband, Aaron, has always been my biggest supporter, or at least that's what I believed until last week. With finals approaching, I dedicated a Saturday to prepare for my final exam, the kind worth a significant chunk of my grade. I set up in our small bedroom, a dimly lit space that was usually filled with warmth but felt claustrophobic under the pressure of looming deadlines. I had placed my phone on Do Not Disturb, drowning out the world, steeling my will against distractions, and I was well into a practice test when I heard the faint creaking of the door. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or a genuine sound breaking my concentration. I told myself I was just imagining it and pressed ahead. The clock was ticking. I could feel my heart rate sinking with its relentless countdown. Just as I reached a particularly tricky question, the door swung open wider than expected, and there stood Aaron, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't knock, he didn't even wait for me to acknowledge him. He simply walked in and, without a word, grabbed the empty coffee cup from my cluttered desk, which wouldn't have been a big deal under normal circumstances, but in that moment, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I exploded, shouting for him to get out and that I was in the middle of an important test. The look on his face morphed into confusion and hurt, making me feel worse almost instantly, yet a primal anger surged in me, an instinctive need to protect my focus at all costs, and I didn't realize I had crossed a line. Aaron backed away as if struck, retreating without another word, and I immediately regretted my outburst. It was never my intention to hurt him, but in the throes of tension, I was blind to everything else. Shaking, I tried to refocus, but the heaviness of my guilt loomed larger than any countdown timer. When I finally returned to the living room post-test, my heart sank deeper. The usually vibrant space felt hollow, too quiet, with tension hanging thick in the air. "Aaron?" I called hesitantly, my voice a small echo against the silence. No answer. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the spare room, but each corner of our home held only emptiness. Panic tightened my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to text him, but just as I was about to fire off a message, I noticed my notifications lighting up. The group chat with my classmates was flooded with frantic messages. "Did you hear about Aaron? I can't believe it, they were right near the corner." And then the most chilling of them all, they said his car is gone. My heart dropped as a gnawing realization settled in. They were talking about the car accident in the news, and my mind raced with desperate images of a twisted metal heap, my husband a possible victim, consequences of his day spiraling out of control for reasons I couldn't fathom. I raced to the living room TV, where a breaking news segment flickered to life, reporters framed by flashing lights, and there was Aaron's car smashed against a tree, completely unrecognizable. They were saying something about speed, a reckless driver, and I felt the world around me shatter anew with every word. Somehow, I remained stuck in my own head, trapped between the anger I felt moments earlier and the fear gripping me now, unable to disentangle from the chaos I had already created. It was my fault. I had shut him out during a moment of sheer panic, blinded by my own selfish needs. I dropped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as guilt twisted into a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't make it? What if my voice had been the last thing he heard? I couldn't bear the thought. I grabbed my things and raced out the door, my heart pounding like a war drum against my ribcage as I sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. Every red light felt like a ticking clock reminding me that I may have lost the only person who meant anything to me. When I finally made it to the ER, a haze of white coats and muffled voices surrounded me, and I stumbled onto a nurse who stopped me, her face a mask of professionalism that seemed utterly indifferent, and my gut twisted with urgency. "Please, where is he?" The nurse looked down and spoke carefully, almost as if she were preparing to shatter whatever shred of hope re-entered my heart. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. We're doing everything we can." I felt my heart drop into the depths of despair as the minutes turned into hours, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of my own actions. The waiting area morphed from an ordinary space into a suffocating chamber of dread where guilt gnawed at my insides, replaying our last moments together like a broken record. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared, and my soul practically leapt into my throat. "He's stable," she said cautiously, "but he's unconscious. You can see him, but..." She paused, and the world around me faded out for a moment. "It's serious." The words felt like ice as I walked into the stark hospital room, seeing Aaron there, hooked to machines, wires snaking around him, face bruised and battered. Reality collided with my trauma, crashing into me with violent force. I approached the bed, heart heavy with emotion, wishing I could take back everything, shouting, turning away. I gently took his hand, squeezing it tightly as if my life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, Aaron. I never wanted this. I had no idea how much I needed you until I almost lost you." Tears continued to flow freely as I sat there, whispering to him, pouring out all the love and regret that had built up inside me. As days turned into a week, the fragile threads of hope began to weave through the darkness, and Aaron slowly started to regain consciousness. The first time his eyes fluttered open, dread coursed through me. What would he say? Would he hate me? I couldn't face that possibility. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't remember the fight, praying my words had reached him somehow. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the harsh fluorescent lights before his gaze fell on me, bewilderment etched across his face. "What happened?" He managed to croak, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief mixed with dread as I prepared to answer. This moment felt pivotal, but in his eyes, I saw forgiveness, possibly a reflection of my own guilt. Maybe he could sense the crushing weight of my regret, or maybe it was just the haze of pain killing every harsh thought. All I could do was nod and squeeze his hand tighter, letting the tears flow. "You got into an accident," I said softly. "You're here now. Just focus on getting better." We had a long road ahead of us, and in that uncertain future lay the lessons of a nightmarish reality, one that had shaken our lives and reminded me of the fragility of every moment we take for granted. It's wild how quickly everything can change, how a simple act of frustration in an innocent moment can lead us to the brink before bringing us back in character-shattering ways. It was in those darkest hours that I realized it was never about the test, but rather the love and understanding we have to nurture. Life is too unpredictable. I vowed never to take him for granted again. So, am I the asshole for shouting at him during a time test? I'm not sure if that label matters anymore.
In 2008, my 7th grade social studies teacher was this somewhat eccentric man named Mr. Thompson, who had a penchant for wearing colorful bow ties and always had a twinkle of an adventure in his eye. But on the first day of class, after hearing him drone on about long-forgotten wars and political treaties, a simple mistake turned a mundane moment into something I still can't shake off. When he introduced himself, I was feeling particularly cheeky and blurted out, "More like Luigi, huh?" as a jab at his over-the-top enthusiasm and the fact that he looked a bit like the cartoon plumber, particularly with that obnoxious mustache he sported. The class erupted in laughter, and Mr. Thompson's face turned a shade of crimson that only fueled my humiliation. Yet, instead of being angry, he chuckled too, a deep belly laugh that seemed to ricochet off the walls of the classroom, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of approval, a bond forming over the absurdity of my joke. From that day on, it was as if a spell had been cast. Students began calling him Luigi, a nickname that echoed around the school like wildfire, morphing entirely from a harmless quip to a rite of passage. Every student from the 7th to the 12th grade knew him only as Luigi. It took on a life of its own, a weird sort of phenomenon that I couldn't comprehend. Teachers would stumble upon him in the hallways and call him Luigi, the administration even began addressing him as such, and as the years passed, he embraced his new identity with surprising grace. He would show up for parent-teacher conferences wearing themed Mario Brothers attire, nonchalantly encouraging parents to call him Luigi and even offering them a free game if they could beat him in Mario Kart, which sounded innocuous but made me feel this creeping dread whenever I thought about how bizarre it all had become. High school teachers would joke that Mr. Thompson, sorry, Luigi transcended the role of educator, morphing into some eccentric figure, a legend, even. He had become the subject of whispers at lunch tables, and I would often hear my classmates discussing how he seemed to relish in the chaos of it all, twisting the narrative around it until one day he claimed to be the true Italian plumber, a bizarre tale he spun about saving the school from this underground monster that lived in the basement, which sounded ludicrous but definitely kept our attention. I graduated in 2012, and like most high school grads, I fled the cocoon of familiarity, but it was hearing snippets and ramblings online from my peers that he continued not just as Luigi but somehow evolved into this almost mythological creature, a viral legend that spread across campus like the very stories of old, students describing encounters with him in the darkened hallways, claiming he'd pop up unexpectedly, seemingly from nowhere, his eyes sparkling with mischief and excitement, telling them all about some secret levels in life they had yet to unlock, which manifestly terrified some of the freshmen who swore they heard him laughing in the shadows. It was perfect horror fodder, but it was also changing something even deeper within the walls of that school. I eventually moved back to town a few years later, seeking a slice of nostalgia, only to find the unmistakable presence of Mr. Thompson, a mere silhouette in the distorting mirror of time. I was pulled into a gathering of old classmates, and when someone casually brought up Luigi, we all recalled his ridiculous antics, the way he carried himself with a goofy grin, like a hidden treasure just waiting to be discovered behind every dusty bookshelf in the library. But in the haze of recollection, the stories concealed grander motives. Bizarre occurrences began to unravel. One night, at our high school reunion, a shiver coursed through me as a couple of us decided to sneak into the school to relive our past. We let our nostalgia lead us back through those echoing hallways, but were met only with an oppressive silence that stifled the laughter of the past. As we approached the classroom that once belonged to Luigi, I suggested we knock. We should at least honor his spirit, remembering him as we always had. But knocking at that door felt unsettling, like opening a gateway to something that existed beyond the realm we knew, and despite a half-hearted attempt, we shrugged it off as a silly whim. Just as we turned to leave, we heard a soft laugh drifting from inside, an unmistakable laugh, echoing the kind of joy that should have warmed us but instead sent chills crawling down my spine. The knot of panic twisted tighter as we glanced at each other, acknowledging that something was very wrong. Against all sensibility, I reached for the handle, and as I swung the door open, the classroom was dark, and somewhere within, I could feel a presence, the kind that consumes your every breath, the air thick with an old burden, and before we could process, there he was, Luigi standing before us, but not as the jovial spirit I once remembered. His eyes glinted with an otherworldly hunger, and in that instant, it was as if all those years of reverence transformed into a far more sinister understanding. "You've come to play, I see," he said, his voice layered with mockery and an unsettling expectancy. And I recoiled as my friends clamored behind me, frozen with dread. Before I could speak, the lights flickered to life, illuminating the room to reveal not just a familiar classroom of knowledge, but twisted images plastered across the walls of our past, images of all the kids who had played this strange game of his, forever trapped in that loop of laughter and horror. But what stunned us more were the eyes. All of us understood the truth at once, those eyes. They were still watching us, peasants in his kingdom of flesh, forever laughing, eternally entrapped in a game we never asked to play, and it hit me like ice water spilling down my spine. Mr. Thompson was no longer just our teacher, he had transformed into something far darker, a figure feeding off the energy of naivete, a teacher entwined with the fabric of our memories, and as we turned to flee, I understood that once you name the monster, it no longer hides in the shadows, it becomes you, and from that day on, we called him Luigi, but with every chuckle shared in the hallways, I knew the laughter would echo forever. And only those that called him by that name would forever feel the weight of his gaze linger long after the joy fades.
When my son turned 10, I decided to throw a party to celebrate his decade of life, inviting his friends and their parents. It felt like a milestone worth marking, a chance to reflect on how quickly he was growing up. As the party flowed through laughter and games, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of memories, gazing at the walls adorned with baby pictures that I'd meticulously hung the night before, each frame a portal to the past, a past where I'd held him tightly for the first time, where every smile he gave felt like a sunbeam cutting through the darkest of nights, especially after his mother left when he was just an infant. My heart raced with nostalgia, thinking of all those moments and how they defined me not just as a parent, but as a person who had faced unimaginable fears alone, and yet I was proud of the heart I had built for him in her absence. But then came a twinge of hesitation as I noticed one of the other parents, a woman named Linda, staring at the pictures with a furrowed brow. During a lull between the games, she approached me, her voice draped in an uncomfortable seriousness that threw me slightly off balance. "You know, it might be time to let go of those baby pictures," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "He's getting older, and it could be a bit humiliating for him someday." I swallowed hard, momentarily dumbfounded as I tried to process the idea of erasing those memories, but I brushed it off, laughing lightly and assuring her that these pictures represented our journey, my love for him immortalized in playful moments. Ida for not deleting my son's baby pictures. I wondered later, but the question lingered uncomfortably. The party continued, disappointment lurking beneath the surface, and as guests slowly departed, I tucked my son into bed. That night, as he drifted off, I sat in the dim light of his room, haunted by Linda's words. The following days fell into an uneasy silence between my son and me. He began withdrawing, his laughter replaced by a hesitant smile, and I couldn't help but feel the pull of something sinister. Was he ashamed of the very memories I cherished? Instead of confronting him directly, I began looking for clues, digging through his schoolwork and activities, hoping to find hints about his secret life outside our home. I found nothing but admiration from his teachers and joy from his friends, yet unease still gnawed at me. His 10th birthday came and went, and that very night, the pictures I had painstakingly hung around the party began to vanish. One by one, they disappeared, and soon, I noticed a pattern as they obscured themselves from me. It was unsettling, knowing moments of my life slipped into untraceable voids, a feedback loop of shadows burying my son's childhood. Every morning, I would awaken determined to hold on to those memories, only to find more of them stripped away, their absence as palpable as the thick blankets of fog that seemed to weave around our house. Desperation carved itself into my heart, driving me to search for digital copies, but attempts to retrieve those files yielded nothing. Friends began to wonder if I was okay, issuing soft words of concern, and I was met with laughter in my son's eyes that grew dimmer every day. The vividness of our shared memories morphed into something dark, and I began waking in the middle of the night, the sensation of tiny fingers grasping at my arm becoming an alarming comfort. I told myself it was just a trick of mine, my exhausted mind grasping at nightmares, but still, there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface, a whisper echoing through the house, saying that I needed to forget, I needed to let go. One evening, I decided to confront my son, asking him directly if he was ashamed of those memories. His shocked look told me all I needed to know, and that's when I noticed it, the first time I had laid eyes on the creeping shadows lining his room, clouds that seemed to pulse and swell. "No, I love those pictures," he finally whispered, but his voice dripped with a kind of languid fear, as if he was too afraid to fight against whatever was smothering the room. In that moment, I realized it wasn't him who felt the weight of shame, it had been someone else all along. Drawing courage from within, I stepped into the room, clenching my fists as the shadows writhed around us like living things, and I shouted the names of every moment, every joyous picture, calling out to those memories before time could bleed them away. In a dizzying surge, the darkness began to retreat, but it was only then I noticed the mirror across the room, its surface reflecting a chilling tableau, dark eyes watching from the other side, a twisted glimpse of a figure I could not comprehend. The realization settled like ice in my veins. The more I tried to hold on to my son's memories, the further they slipped, and every night, I felt that unknown presence slipping through the veil, reclaiming what it believed belonged with it. Either my son or those memories were to be consumed, and I had to make a choice. Heart pounding, I reached for my son, pulling him towards me just as the night enveloped the room in a heavy shroud, but somehow, I sensed the darkness closing in behind us, a whirlwind of dread that seemed to materialize with malevolence. "Don't let go, please," he cried, and I realized that letting go meant giving in to the shadows. With every ounce of strength I possessed, I wrenched open the window, the cool night air rushing in, trying to breathe life back into the fading memories. Every laugh, every moment our hearts shared cascaded into the open air like a haunting melody, and just when I thought the shadow might consume us both, I roared into the night, "I will not let you take them." In that instant, the very fabric of my reality warped, as if the essence of those memories surged back into the room, a blaze of light igniting the darkness, scattering it into nothingness, and for once, I felt our memories solidify around us. But as dawn broke, and we emerged from that battle, I was left alone to confront the remnants of what we had faced. Around us lay remnants of old photographs burned into ashes at the foot of the window, as if those memories had indeed been claimed but then lifted from existence. What remained were the shards of those years, a reminder of the battle where every picture held fragments of our past. As I looked into my son's eyes, knowing the laughter we had shared would forever echo in the silence, I realized I hadn't just fought for memories, I had fought for his childhood. But in that realization lurked a more sinister truth: I couldn't outrun the darkness. While memories might fade, would the malevolence that sought to erase what we loved ever truly let go? I'm left with an irrefutable question: Ida, for not deleting my son's baby pictures. Because in this haunting memory of loss, maybe I'm still trapped in a sinister echo, fighting not to forget.
I don't always come home from work straight away. I pull over somewhere and chill for an hour or so. It started as a harmless habit, a way to decompress after an exhausting day at the call center, where the sound of my voice droning through endless customer complaints blurred my sense of self. I found this rundown park on the outskirts of town that nobody seemed to visit, an oasis of disconnection. With its crooked picnic tables and the hollow echo of silence, it became my refuge. At first, I'd play solitaire on my phone or scroll aimlessly through social media, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park descended into a veil of shadow, I began to notice the transformations of the landscape around me. One evening, as I kicked pebbles on the path, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure in a faded brown hoodie, its face obscured, stood by the edge of the woods. I waved, half-heartedly expecting them to retreat into the thicket, but they merely stared, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. Rather than panic, a strange sense of calm enveloped me, as if they were a part of the scenery, another shade of night creeping into my world. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, that I'd simply imagined the whole encounter from spending too much time alone. But after that, every time I parked at the old lot, I felt a pulse of energy in the air, a whisper of unseen eyes watching me from behind the trees. The figure returned again, always motionless, always just out of reach. I learned their routine: on Tuesdays, they'd be there just as the sun vanished, and on Thursdays, they'd be gone before I settled into my usual spot. I started rearranging my schedule, choosing to leave work late, my heart racing with anticipation when I finally saw them, little more than a shadow, yet almost magnetic in their stillness. I began to stay longer, often pushing past the hour mark, drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the urge to understand what this specter wanted from me. But as the weeks crept on, dread seeped into my fascination. One chilly evening, the figure approached the car, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly okay with the distance that loomed between us. Their hoodie hung loosely, hiding all but the faint outline of their body. My heart thumped. I contemplated leaving, revving my engine, but my curiosity swelled into something louder, compelling me to stay. I rolled down my window, hesitating like a fool, and asked, "Who are you?" The figure simply cocked its head, and in that moment, I could almost feel the trees lean in, as if they were waiting for the answer just as much as I was. They drew closer, the rustling leaves around them amplifying a tension I couldn't quite escape, and finally spoke. "You leave them every night, don't you?" The words sliced through the crisp air, chilling me to the bone. I stammered, grappling with the unexpected emotion that washed over me, an unsettling mix of recognition and fear. "No, I don't," I protested. But the figure merely smiled, though I could not see their lips move beneath the fabric of the hoodie. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I didn't understand, yet I felt strings pulling, colors swirling in my mind as if fate had rewinded a terrible secret from my past, something I'd tossed in a box deep within my mind. As if my insides churned, the memories streamed in, late phone calls, neglected promises, and unmade decisions that had haunted me ever since my brother vanished without a trace 5 years ago. My throat tightened, breath caught in a web of regret as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes wide, seeking clarity in the dim light cast by my headlights. That night, I drove home feeling heavy, yet light, like I'd peeled a layer of myself off. The figure hadn't been a stranger but a haunting memory shaped like a person, a catalyst for the guilt I bore in silence. I tried to shake the sensation, but it crept back, a relentless specter in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and every time I parked at the lot, the figure seemed to glide between my thoughts and the reality outside my window. They became a linkage to the sense of hope I had lost somewhere in my brother's absence. On the occasions when I neglected to visit the park and rushed home, I could almost feel their expectant gaze on my back, coaxing me to return, to confront what I was running from. My co-workers began noticing my changing demeanor, whispers of concern circling their conversations, but I brushed them off, convincing myself I was fine, that this was just a way to reclaim a portion of myself lost to grief. One particularly frigid night, after a hellish shift, I felt a summons nearly magnetic, driving me to the park with a purpose that I could no longer deny. My heart pounded in anticipation as I parked in that familiar space, the darkness wrapping around me like an embrace. The figure stood where they always did, But this time, there was an air of finality in their stillness. I could sense the weight of every unconfessed secret and the echoed memories of loss and guilt tingling against my skin. I climbed out of my car, the air was thick, my breath hanging in the night, and for the first time, I whispered as if speaking to the darkness itself, "I'm sorry." The figure stepped closer, their silhouette melding with the night until all I could see were their eyes, reflecting the last remnants of daylight. Without a word, they reached behind them and handed me a small, weather-worn object, a keychain, twisted and contorted, that felt oddly warm in my palm. The familiarity ignited the flame of memories, it had been my brother's. Rage and sorrow bubbled within me, the unquenchable need for closure spiraling. I looked up, demanding understanding, but all I saw was a fleeting silhouette being swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I gasped, a hollowness pooling in my chest, as I staggered back to my car, the keychain clutched tightly in my hand. Driving home that night, I didn't know if I freed a piece of my past or if the figure was a reflection of what I still had to confront. The park visits became less frequent, burdened with meaning and unwilling to offer solace like before. Yet, every now and then, as the lonely streetlights flickered past my window, I could see them standing at the edge of the woods on a Tuesday or Thursday. I learned then that the specters we try to avoid often find us in the corners of our minds, waiting to be acknowledged. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat on my couch, that keychain still in my pocket, reflecting on everything I had left unspoken, and felt a pull to those forgotten hours at the park. I could almost hear the rustling whispers beckoning me to return, to sit in silence as darkness enveloped the world outside. No longer did I see the figure as a ghoul of my past but as a guide to my future. So I drove back to the park, ready to face my haunting. When I pulled up, my breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't there. I felt disoriented, as if I had stumbled into an alternate reality I never knew existed. I opened the car door, stepping onto the grounds rendered barren and brightened by strange lights that flickered just beyond the trees, inviting me closer with their pulse. There, a previous absence in the shadows revealed something far worse. The park pulsed as if it were alive, and I was not alone after all. I took a trembling step forward, the keychain in my pocket heating, an urgency blossoming within me, pulling me toward the heart of the park where the lights beckoned, a truth waiting to engulf me whole. I could feel the figure born from the shadows begin to stretch and weave around me, watching silently, the night alive with stories untold. I just broke my 5-month-long amphetamine abstinence streak, and I'm afraid it might have cost me my life. It all started when I decided to step into this dingy little shop tucked away in an alley, a relic from a bygone era, with peeling paint and neon lights flickering like a dying star. I hadn't meant to fall off the wagon, after all, I'd fought tooth and nail to resist the temptations that whispered sweet nothings into my ear, but that evening's weight on my chest was unbearable. I should have turned back when the musky scent of stale cigarettes hit my nostrils or when I saw a figure hunched low in the shadows, but the need inside me blazed hotter. I exchanged some crumpled bills for a small vial, the powder gleaming under the dim light, and as the first rush surged through me, I felt lighter than air, untethered from the grim reality of my life. The euphoria pulsed through my veins, laughter bubbling up unbidden as I roamed the city streets, the world shimmered with vivid colors, and each sound was a melody to my ears. For a moment, I believed I was invincible, free from the demons I'd been battling, but I didn't realize they were lying in wait like wolves in the dark. Days morphed into nights, and as the high wore off, the paranoia crept in. It began with shadows shifting on the walls, whispers echoing in my mind, insisting someone was watching me. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet behind me, the flicking of cigarette lighters, echoing like skittish drum beats, and when I turned, there was nothing, just empty streets and a moon that hung too low in the ink-black sky. I dismissed my fears as nothing more than side effects, until one evening, as I stumbled into an abandoned bus station while the temperature plummeted, I stumbled upon a scene that shattered my reality. In the flickering light, there was a figure slumped against the wall, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that sent a chill racing down my spine. I could see the blue veins spiderwebbing across their pale skin, a grotesque reminder of a person who had once been alive. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me, this was no ordinary person. I felt their gaze piercing through the fog of my thoughts, accusatory, as if they knew the darkness that had taken the place of my soul. I rushed out, adrenaline fueling my flight, but the whispers grew louder until they screamed in my head, urging me to keep running. I thought I could escape the vision, but it lingered, haunting my every step, trembling laughter vibrating through the cracks of my mind. Days blurred together, leading to a haze of sleepless nights and frantic pacing, the figure always lurking at the periphery because now I could feel it, hot breath against my neck, fingers brushing my scalp as I tossed and turned, paralyzed by a mix of fear and guilt. Each smile from strangers became a sinister threat, each laughter a taunt. None of them understood the weight pressing on my chest like the earth was determined to swallow me whole. I tried to talk to friends, dragging myself to their doors, but when I mentioned the figure, the vacant expressions on their faces told me everything. They couldn't see what I saw, didn't hear the horrors that echoed behind my eyes. Soon my friends became ghosts, and I was left in a world that had turned eerie with the weight of my every sin. I tried to wash away the dread with another hit, chasing the high that eluded me, but nothing worked. Every attempt sent me spiraling deeper into the abyss, each line just a reminder of my failures. The nights grew longer, the shadows thicker, and I lost track of the days until I stood in that same bus station again, convinced I could confront my phantom. But this time, the air was icy with something other than fear, something palpable crackled around me, something dark. I called out, "What do you want from me?" My voice echoed back, fractured and warped, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I waited, heart thundering in my chest, until finally those pale, unfocused eyes found mine, and the figure began to rise, grotesque, the limbs unfolding as it stepped into the hallowed light. It looked like me, an echo of my flesh, yet distorted in ways that twisted my stomach, a mocking reminder of everything I had lost. I stumbled back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, watching helplessly as it reached out with elongated fingers, its mouth curling into a smile that sent icy fingers crawling up my spine, and in that moment, I realized, this was no ghost, but a reflection of my soul stripped bare by addiction, the cost of giving in. I turned to escape, tearing down those unwelcoming streets, but the darkness chased me, laughter echoing in my ears, as my shadows stretched longer and more grotesque, the taste of metal seeping into my mouth, exhaustion clawing at my bones. I knew I needed to stop, to go back, but each breath turned to fire, and I splintered too far down the path, consumed by a terror I'd created. A siren shrieked in the distance, and I could almost feel freedom brushing against my fingertips, but as I stumbled towards it, the ground shifted beneath me, and I fell, the world around spinning like a mad carousel until I was engulfed in darkness. And then I woke in the bus station with a throbbing headache, the cheap cry of a flickering neon the only witness to my undoing, the figure watching me from the shadows, a mere echo of my choices. But I know, this time, I can't run because it's what I've become that haunts me, a ghost in the twilight, a prisoner of every decision that led me back to a hollow life. And if you're reading this, trust me when I say addiction waits in the wings, ready to pounce at your slightest moment of weakness, rendering you more of a monster than you ever thought you could be. It was a muggy Wednesday evening when I found it, tucked under a twisted patch of weeds near a lamppost, a neat, tightly bound stack of cash, crisp and untouched, totaling $800. My heart raced with exhilaration and guilt. What were the odds of encountering such a fortune just lying there? I looked around, half expecting someone to rush back for it, but the street was empty, save for a few stray cats scavenging the darkening alleyway. Lured by the promise of a small fortune and a fleeting belief that maybe, just maybe, this was some cosmic karma for my endless run of bad luck, I pocketed the money and hurried home, my mind racing through fantasies, new clothes, a weekend getaway. But when the euphoric thrill subsided, an unsettling thought began to creep in. Who had lost this money, and why was it just sitting there? I pushed it aside, convinced it was my stroke of luck. That night, I fell asleep thinking I had scored, dreaming of countless possibilities, yet, the dreams twisted darker as the hours wore on. I woke up to find my room flooded with moonlight, shadows danced along the walls, and an unnerving sense of dread pooled in my gut, a feeling that I had crossed a line. Shaking it off, I spent the cash over the next few days, indulging in new sneakers, dinners out, and a vintage vinyl collection I'd coveted for ages, all the while ignoring the gnawing sensation like I was being watched. Then, on the third night after my little spree, a soft knock echoed from my front door, pulling me from sleep. Heart pounding in my chest, I peered through the peephole, but there was only darkness on the other side. I hesitated before finally opening it, and there was nothing. I rationalized it must have been the house settling, yet as I climbed back into bed, an unsettling chill ran through me. Nights turned into restless fever dreams, where shadows lurked, and I could hear whispers drifting through the walls as if the house itself carried secrets. I decided to go on a weekend camping trip to clear my head, hoping fresh air would wash away the anxiety, but instead, my unease morphed into paranoia. I kept feeling someone tailing me back to my tent, shadows flitting just beyond the glow of the campfire. On the night of my return, I found a note slipped under my door, a single line, "You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours." Panic consumed me. I ripped it from the floor and scoured my apartment for hidden cameras or surveillance equipment, but nothing was amiss. I thought of going to the police, but part of me was terrified they'd see me as a thief. The feeling of dread clawed at me, and my dreams became nightmares of strangers with hollowed eyes and grins that shifted unnaturally. One evening, wrapped in my own self-imposed isolation, I decided to return to that lamppost where it all began, a futile act of atonement, an absurd gesture against an invisible foe. The street was eerily quiet, moonlight illuminating the cracked pavement, but when I reached that spot, my heart sank. The area was now barren, as if the ground itself had decided to swallow whatever remained of that hidden treasure. Suddenly, an icy breeze whipped around me, and from the shadows, I saw a figure emerge, stretched limbs, a pale face, and eyes that burned with a bright, unnatural light, locking onto mine with a grip of unimaginable terror, and it spoke in a voice laced with rage, "You took what was mine." I stumbled back, stumbling over my own feet as the realization hit me. This was no mere stalker or oppressor, it was something far worse, a spirit of vengeance awakened by my greed. I ran, my heart slamming against my ribs, but no matter how fast I sprinted, I could feel it gaining on me, colder air brushing against my neck like icy fingers. I burst into my home, slamming the door behind me, but the moment my back hit the wood, the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. In that suffocating void, I could hear the soft thud of footsteps. "You're never alone," they seemed to whisper, and suddenly I realized those whispers weren't in my head, they echoed from beyond the walls, from the very depths of the house, spiraling around me like a distant echo of their grief. I ran for my phone to call for help, but as soon as I picked it up, a bone-chilling growl erupted from the corners of my apartment, making me drop it to the floor. The air turned thick with an angry energy, and out of desperation, I screamed, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Please, just leave me alone." Silence fell like a crushing weight, but the peace didn't last long. The lights burst back on, revealing my living room immersed in shadows stretching and writhing on the walls, and as I turned, there it was again. That wretched figure, now standing right behind me, a sinister smile splitting across its face. "It's too late for apologies. You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours," it hissed, its breath cold as winter frost, and I felt my heart shatter. In an instant, the world faded to black, and when I opened my eyes, I was right back at that lamppost, but this time, I was staring down at my own lifeless form sprawled on the cracked pavement, as another wretch like me moved to gather the cash scattered beside my body. And in that moment, I understood, the cash was never meant for me, it was a curse, an anchor to drag the greedy into the abyss, and as my hollowed eyes looked back at the living world, I realized I was doomed to wander these silent streets, watching one unfortunate soul after another pick up that cursed money and spark the cycle of misery all over again. When I received the invitation to the pool party from Sasha, a social media influencer known for her extravagant gatherings, I felt a rush of excitement alongside the inevitable twinge of doubt. I didn't really know her, though we shared a few mutual friends, and I imagined we'd be sipping cocktails by the glimmering water, surrounded by laughter and music. The day of the party, I donned my best swimsuit, something vibrant enough to catch an eye but simple enough to blend in, as I arrived at her sprawling suburban mansion, where the twinkling lights hung from the palm trees like whimsical stars, casting a warm glow on a crowd buzzing with chatter. As I stepped onto the patio, I was met by the smell of sunscreen mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, an earthy, almost sour aroma that set my nerves on edge as the laughter picked up and a faint sound of splashing echoed from the pool, but I shrugged it off, diving into the mingling and pretending I belonged. About an hour in, my stomach twisted in a sudden wave of nausea. I thought maybe it was the shrimp cocktail I'd indulged in a bit too eagerly, so I excused myself to the bathroom, desperately hoping to alleviate the discomfort. It was then I noticed the sign above the toilet, "Please do not flush anything but toilet paper," and I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease in the pit of my stomach as I obeyed the rules, wary of what anything might mean in a home where guests clearly followed no discernible hygiene standards. The insipid laughter outside morphed into a cacophony of whoops and yells as some guests engaged in drunken pool games, but a sickly sweet smell wafted in from the open window, making me recoil. I couldn't pinpoint the scent, but it felt wrong, almost like my instincts were screaming at me to get out. When I rejoined the party, I'd hoped my discomfort would fade, but more and more, I noticed the guests reaching for the buffet and barely managing a smile as they tucked into molded cakes and charred hot dogs. Their faces warped slightly as laughter rang out, but behind their eyes was a glimmer of something darker, a shared secret that whispered from one guest to the next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the laughter fading into something with sharper edges, when I caught a group of girls crowded around Sasha, pointing, their giggles morphing into wild shrieks of delight that were somehow vicious. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I leaned in, desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever had caught their interest. Alas, the sight left me paralyzed. Floating grotesquely in the pool, unnoticed by the oblivious revelers, was a murky swirl, a mass of putrid brown, trailing like a vile ribbon through the water. Panic gripped me, and I took a step back. Did they notice? Didn't they see it? I whispered to myself while trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but every time I stole a glance, the horrid mass grew larger, its revolting viscosity undulating, taunting me as I felt bile rise in my throat. Suddenly, as if commanded by an unseen force, a few partygoers lured Sasha into the pool, and as they splashed about, their laughter turned into wild shrieks as the surface of the water erupted. The mass began to break apart, horrifyingly, and without any warning, a soft cloud of odor billowed up, wrapping around those careless partygoers, forcing them to stop in their tracks. What happened next was indescribable. It was a slow-motion moment where realization dawned, reflected in each face that had once been joyful, eyes going wide in horror as they recoiled from the foul stench now filling the air and churning the festal atmosphere into something terrifying as they splashed and scrambled blindly out of the water. But instead of panic audible, their laughter returned falsely, layered with manic joy as they realized what lay just beneath the surface. Screams erupted as more of the guests caught wind of the pungent reality about what had just emerged from the depths of the pool, the sound borderline ecstatic with a touch of primal fear. Sasha, however, didn't seem to mind. If anything, it seemed to fuel her wildness, because in her gleeful dance around the pool, she beckoned others to join, and that was when I caught a glimpse of something even darker in her expression, a glint akin to madness. I felt frozen, repulsed yet inexplicably enthralled as the guests dove back into the pool, laughing, not just out of fright but something far more exhilarating. One by one, they submerged themselves in the filth, sloshing around, as if they were high on the thrill of the taboo, ignoring the utter mess the water had become, convinced perhaps that it was part of the show, the night turning chaotic, desperate, and I just couldn't shake the feeling of having stepped into a nightmare that blurred the line between horror and sanctioned revelry. I turned to escape, only to find the patio packed tighter than before. People were laughing with abandon, and yet, a shadow passed over my heart as I caught Sasha's gaze locked onto me, a predator sizing up prey, manic joy reflecting back at me as if I were now part of their grotesque game, and as I stumbled backward, colliding with another guest, I realized there was no exit in sight. The laughter spiraled into something else, filled with the stench of something lost to reason. I hurried past the thrumming music, unable to swallow the reality that I had been lured into something twisted, a gathering gone wrong, but I still held on to the faint hope that I could amble my way back to freedom. The last tendrils of merriment faded into laughter that echoed ominously as I darted toward the edge of the pool, nightmares stirring around me, drowning in a fatal tide of laughter while I desperately clawed at the resin wrap of my sanity, knowing only that whatever mad party this was, it had become a twisted performance of the grotesque while I became the outsider watching as, to my horror, the party transformed into what felt like a crude ritual of acceptance, a cacophony of cheers rising above as I flailed toward the exit, realizing too late I had come to the wrong kind of party, one where they weren't merely pretending to revel in the chaos but had surrendered to it entirely, becoming entranced in something I couldn't fathom, and for them, it was the beginning of a ritual that made the horrors of the world pale in comparison. And in my panic to escape, among the forgotten stains of laughter, the realization hit me hard. To them, this was the best party ever, and perhaps that was the scariest part of it all. Once invited, you could never truly leave.
When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way, a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. You know it's important to my family, right? The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad. A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families. Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. You need to come home. Now. Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. We'll make this right, he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found ourselves entrenched. Now a question ignited within, Ida for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage.
I can't shake the image of that woman I encountered today. She haunts my thoughts like a ghost that refuses to rest. It started innocently enough, my morning routine altered by the blaring sun that devoured the chill of early autumn. I was deep in thought, barely noticing as I walked to my campus library, my mind swirling with the usual existential dread of a 22-year-old who feels tangled in a web of expectation. But then, out of nowhere, she appeared like an apparition in my peripheral vision, seated with purposeful grace at a cafe table, fingers dancing across the floral printed journal that rested in her lap. Her hair shone like a raven's wing, cascading down her shoulders, framing a face that was ethereal yet eerily devoid of familiarity. I didn't mean to stare, but I felt tethered to the moment, as if she had plucked me from my mundane thoughts and thrown me into a vivid dreamscape filled with unexplored potential. I could make out her laughter, effervescent and joyous, as a couple, clearly friends, leaned into conversation with her, but there was a bitterness that curled around my heart when I saw her gaze drift unfazed past them, lightly haunting and lost, as though she had forgotten how to engage with the world around her. I considered walking over, driven by an impulse that felt simultaneously foolish and exhilarating, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. I was struck by the inexplicable fear that if I left my covert perch at the edge of the cafe, something might fracture between us, like a spell unbroken. It was intoxicating, the way she seemed to exist outside time, and I risked another glance before succumbing to the waves of uncertainty that crashed within me. I wondered if she noticed me, the way I noticed her, a fleeting yet profound connection filled with all the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Hours later, as I tried to shake off the image of her sparkling eyes, they danced behind my eyelids every time I tried to sleep, her features weaving themselves into the fabric of my thoughts until it all felt inevitable. That night, I decided to return to the same cafe, believing that maybe, just maybe, chance would gift me a second interaction, a fleeting moment to bridge the divide between strangers. But when I walked through the threshold, the atmosphere paused, the cafe was relentlessly empty, and my heart sank deeper with each step. I searched frantically for her, the spell she had woven around my mind tightening with every passing moment, but she was nowhere to be found, the silence echoing my desperation. Maybe I was foolish to believe in the magic of coincidence, perhaps it was just a product of whimsy that would fade like the sunset. Days turned into restless nights consumed by thoughts of her, the images swirling until I started to feel, maybe, she was a figment of my imagination, conjured by a lonely heart. Yet, with each dusk, I returned, searching for a glimmer of that elusive connection. It felt like a tragic obsession, my yearning morphing into something darker. It all came to a head after a week of this maddening ritual. I thought I detected movement from the corner of my eye. There she was, seated apart from the usual patrons as if she were a queen in exile, still scribbling in that same journal, though the cafe was empty enough to amplify the quiet that surrounded her. I barely breathed, a mix of fear and ecstasy flooding my senses. I took one cautious step forward but halted in my tracks as something unnatural thrummed in the air. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, her eyes bolted to me with an intensity that sent ice coursing through my veins, but instead of the bright connection I longed for, there was something ominous lurking within those depths, as if she was suddenly aware of a storm brewing in the distance. I felt indecisive, my heart raced for the chance to approach, but my instincts screamed at me to flee. Just then, the cafe door swung open, and the bright jangle of bells startled me. A man, scruffy and disheveled, stumbled through the entryway like he was drawn by an invisible string, his eyes wild and frantic. In that sliver of time, he locked onto the woman and charged toward her, shouting incoherently in a language that seemed twisted in anger. A chill cascaded through the room as I stood frozen. She recoiled at his approach, her expression shifting from one of surprise to bleak resignation. The moment tore at the fabric of reality, and as I willed my limbs to move, and it felt like running through molasses. The scruffy man reached her, his hands gesturing wildly. I could see her eyes, wide with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, but in that instant, I glimpsed recognition wash over her face. This was no mere stranger, but someone forged from her past, an echo that had come back, threatening to shatter the evening's fragile peace. Just as I reached the brink of my resolve to intervene, she whispered something, but it was lost in the chaos of their confrontation. Then he lunged forward, and I finally broke the spell, rushing to them just as he grabbed her wrist with a force that made my stomach twist. "You can't escape this," he barked, but I was standard college kid, albeit with the energy of a cornered animal at that moment. I shoved him back, adrenaline surging. He stumbled but regained his footing, eyes glistening with a mix of fury and madness that terrified me more than his physicality. "Stay away from her," I shouted, the anger igniting something I didn't know I had. I could have fled, I could have left this just as a single haunting memory, but she wasn't just a passing thought anymore. She was everything. In that moment, we seemed intertwined, her gaze flickering between me and her assailant. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled just for me, a crack of light piercing through the chaos, and it fueled my fire. Without thinking, I shoved the man yet again, fueled more by instinct than rational thought, but this time he pinned me, jarring me into reality. "Let her go," I bellowed, my voice filled with urgency, but as I glanced over, her smile twisted into another forlorn gaze. "This isn't your fight," she pleaded, but I refused to listen, my pulse racing, emboldened by a drive I never knew I had. The man fell to his knees with a cry, releasing her wrist, and for an instant, the air felt charged, like electricity before a storm. But as the few patrons who had gathered murmured among themselves, something shifted within that man. He straightened up, an unsettling calm washing over him as his features morphed into something unsettlingly familiar. I watched in horror as his eyes glazed, an eerie smile spreading across his face as he slowly turned, locking eyes with me, and in that moment, his face morphed into what felt like a reflection of my own, warped and twisted in a mirror of dread. The cafe spun around me, and I found myself slack-jawed, paralyzed as the lines between our realities blurred. Suddenly, he broke into laughter, a sound that echoed like an accusatory dirge, and I felt the weight of that smile growing impossibly wide as he muttered, "You've drawn her in, haven't you?" Panic unfurled in my chest, reality felt thin, like it could tear at the seams. The woman I had been obsessing over, the one I felt could understand me, was no mere stranger, but a part of a more insidious web. The cafe faded into a void, dragging me into the unknown, where the promise of escape turned into an intricate trap, my obsession binding us together, each piece drawing tighter, closer to an unspeakable revelation that could change everything I thought I knew. In those suffocating moments, I could see her trapped within the layers of my mind, struggling to unearth the truth, but her face was becoming something unrecognizable, a flattened reflection of every fear I had ever felt. In a flash, it occurred to me that my fixation wasn't just a simple daydream but part of a darker narrative that tethered her existence to my own. The edges of time curved around us as we spiraled together, beckoning an unforgiving crescendo that threatened to consume us both whole, leaving behind nothing but shadows and echoes beneath a sterile gaze that watched from above, unseen but omnipresent, as if orchestrating a grand design that I alone could not alter. 2 hours ago, I found myself in a grimy corner of a gas station, heart racing from both the caffeine and the realization that I had just become an unwilling participant in a hostage situation. The stench of stale coffee mixed with the faint scent of cigarettes was suffocating as I watched a man, his face jagged with desperation and anger, point an unsteady handgun directly at me from behind the counter, his other hand clutching a crumpled paper bag filled with cash. I remember my thoughts racing. I should have just filled up my tank and left, but I was frozen with fear, my instincts screaming at me to run, to hide. Time blurred around me, the sunlight outside fading into a surreal, muted glow as I tried to decipher what to do. I tightly grasped the chipped edge of the counter, feeling like I was about to topple over, when deep down, I felt this overwhelming urge to defuse the situation instead of fleeing. I don't know why I felt that, but somehow, I found the courage to speak, to calm him down. "Hey, man, it's all right. Just breathe. You don't have to do this," I said, voice trembling but steady. He flinched at my words, his eyes darting with confusion and something softer, a glimpse of humanity before it was swallowed by desperation. For a brief moment, it felt like I was standing in a vacuum, the world and its noise shrunk away as I looked directly into his haunted gaze, and I could see him, just a man who had hit rock bottom instead of a monster with a gun. In a moment of raw courage, or perhaps sheer insanity, I stepped closer, which made the man jerk back, his finger twitching dangerously by the trigger. "I can help you," I continued, my voice low but firm, inching even closer to the edge of the counter. "It doesn't have to end like this. There's got to be a better way. Just talk to me." I don't know what possessed me to put myself in such danger, but somehow, I saw that flicker of understanding in his eyes again. Behind the grime and desperation, he was just a man, scared and hopeless. I saw a flash of pain that bridged the gap between us, and in that heartbeat, he lowered the gun, confusion stamped across his face. It was as if he was slowly waking from a nightmare. He looked around, the realization of what he was doing crashing down upon him. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, and I could see the panic begin to sprawl across his features. I didn't mean to," he stammered, but before he could finish, I heard the unmistakable howl of police cars pulling into the lot. The man twitched with fear and suddenly, adrenaline surged within him, pulling the gun back towards me, this time with a fully realized intent. "Get the hell out. This is your fault," he shouted, and without thinking, I dove for him, grabbing his wrist and twisting, hoping to distract him long enough for the police to make their move. My mind was swirling, and in that split second, adrenaline propelled me as I managed to knock the gun from his hand, the weight of our bodies crashing into the floor as I wrestled to restrain him. Chaos erupted, the sound of yelling, the shattering of glass, and the rush of footsteps as law enforcement swarmed in, handcuffs clicking around his wrists just as my heart began to slow. I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he was taken away, a mix of anger and gratitude. I had saved him from whatever darkness had driven him to that point, yet in my heart, I felt disgusted by the whole ordeal. The hero in the movies doesn't have to tackle his would-be murderer to the floor, he just stands tall, claiming his victory. I expected that moment would fill me with hope, but as I left that gas station, adrenaline still pumping through my veins, dread washed over me, particularly when I glanced at the time. I've always been a night owl, but as the stars flickered into existence, I felt an uneasy tingle down my spine, as if something loomed in the shadows just beyond my vision. I decided to take a long way home, turning on the radio in a futile attempt to shake off what happened and its lingering grip on my mind. Just a few blocks from home, I stopped at a red light and felt an instinctive chill crawl across the back of my neck as if I wasn't alone. I looked into my rearview mirror upon feeling those eyes boring into me, and there, in the darkness, was the outline of a figure standing by the entrance to a convenience store. It was him, the man from the gas station. Our eyes connected, and though it was only a fraction of a moment, the haunting memory surged back, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Screams erupted in my mind. I thought that maybe he would just fade away like a character from a bad dream, but he didn't. Those tired, hungry eyes remained fixed on mine, his glare burning with an intensity that sent a surge of cold terror through me. The light changed, and I pushed down on the gas pedal, just wanting to put distance between us. My breaths quickened as I turned corners, heart racing as paranoia kicked in, shadows mingling with the darkened streets. I was about to let down my guard when suddenly, my phone rang, a sharp break in my fevered daze, and seeing my mother's name flashing across the screen momentarily distracted me. I answered shakily, managing to tell her I was all right, but the call felt like a strange farewell. As I hung up, I glanced out my window again, and dread hardened my gut. The man was there, now mere feet away, following my car with a kind of keen focus that made my skin prickle with sharp apprehension. The moment our eyes met again, something shifted behind that look. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, an idea forming. Instead of running away in fear, I dared to breathe. Perhaps there was still a shred of humanity left in him. "Please," I found myself whispering, "don't do this." I had saved his life once, and all I wanted was to keep my own. I tried to convince myself that I had witnessed his potential, that perhaps he could change, yet as he stepped closer, with each relentless approach my fear twisted into something darker. I drove faster, weaving through the fog of the night, but every time I glanced at my mirror, he was right there, a haunting specter filled with unyielding purpose. His persistence unnerved me until I could hear my own heartbeat drumming alongside the thrum of my thoughts. What the hell does he want from me? The streets twisted and turned into an inescapable labyrinth, and just when I thought I'd lost him in the layers of darkness, the realization hit. I could feel a surge of cold rage, sharp and bitter, spread through me, a furious conclusion that I was not the hero of the night, but rather just a pawn in whatever twisted game he had in mind. I made a rash decision, turning into a nearby alley where my heart pounded heavy in my chest, praying I'd find somewhere to hide or perhaps even lose him in the serpentine aftermath of my reckless driving. But just as I pulled to a stop, his figure loomed in my peripheral vision, devastatingly close. I let out a shaky breath, stumbling out of the car, adrenaline coursing through my veins, a desperate force pushing my feet into action. This was not how my night was supposed to end. I should have felt relief after leaving that hellish gas station, but now, the air was thick with fear, every step I took giving life to a growing sense of dread. The shadows danced around me, mocking me, as I glanced over my shoulder to see him round the corner, his presence no longer merely a reflection of my past but a palpable entity closing in, lurking in the darkness. Just seconds turned into an eternity, my heart racing faster than my thoughts could grasp, fear gripping me like a vice as I stumbled backward and stumbled right into the wall. I could see the glint of something metallic glimmering in his hand, a blade. And at that moment, I realized I was not just in danger, I had awakened something inside him, a monster awakened by my act of kindness, opposed to the heroism I had imagined. My thoughts spiraled as I recalled the terrified look in his eyes just moments before the police restrained him. He was no longer the shaken man clinging to the precipice of sanity. Instead, I was staring into the abyss of his rage, a feral intensity that threatened to consume us both. I thought of my reckless choice to help him, Of the night I dragged him back and had quelled the ominous storm. In that instant, it became painfully clear that whatever spark of humanity I thought I had glimpsed was long gone, leaving behind only the void that made him lethal. When he lunged at me, I barely reacted, my mind suffocated by terror as I fumbled for anything to defend myself, and suddenly our roles became clear. I was now the prey while he was the predator. But that's when instinct kicked in, and I found a rock beneath my feet, hoisting it toward him with what strength remained, smashing it against his head before pushing past him and sprinting into the night, not daring to look back despite the shouts that echoed behind me. I ran in frenzied bursts, unable to predict where I was going, only that every inch brought me further from the weaponless shell that barely survived 2 hours ago. The sounds of footfalls were like thunder roaring behind me, threatening to consume me whole, propelling me through darkened streets, adrenaline coursing through every fiber of my being. I don't know how long I ran, pushing my legs beyond their limits until I finally found the scent of life, neon lights in the distance, a welcome sanctuary of movement amidst the encroaching darkness, fueled with hope that I'd find refuge within the arms of other people. When I stumbled into that diner, breathless, shaking, I expected to feel relief wash over me, but all I felt was the weight of the night bearing down, every ounce of that fear coiling tightly around my throat. The staff and patrons looked at me, bloodied, wild-eyed, as if I were a ghost materializing from a nightmare no one could fully comprehend. I tried to explain, to form coherent words amidst the panic, but when the sirens blared just beyond the windows, my words faded into gasps, fear overpowering me entire. As the police barged into the diner, searching, I felt the trembling reality. He was out there, somewhere in the shadows, and I had unknowingly opened the door to chaos that would haunt me eternally. When they found me, I was clutching a salt shaker like a weapon, feeling foolish yet scared, and perhaps I reminded them of someone who had lost themselves right before their eyes. They took my hands and recounted the night, assuring me they would protect me. But deep inside, I knew that my savior had turned hunter, and no matter how many nights I spent in safety, the monster's rage lingered on the edges of my mind. I had saved a man's life, and in return, he had taken mine, weaving us both into a twisted reality where nightmares are born from the very flecks of humanity we hope to hold on to.
I had always been a proud, open-minded person, but the moment my husband suggested hosting his niece and her friends for a weekend, my heart sank into my stomach like a stone. "They're just kids," he said when I expressed my discomfort. "It'll be fun." I smiled weakly, but a knot twisted in my gut as I remembered the incidents that had taken place in our small town recently, reports of children disappearing, strange eyes watching from the shadows, whispers that drifted across the playground late at night. It wasn't the kids themselves I disliked, it was the haunting feeling that something was terribly wrong. The first night they arrived, laughter filled our home, but it was an eerie kind of laughter, one that clawed at my insides. The kids immediately started playing hide and seek, but not under the usual terms. They seemed to forget the boundaries, darting into rooms we hadn't even entered yet, giggling and peeking out like they knew secrets we didn't. I felt like a ghost in my own house, stuck in a nightmare where I was simultaneously an unwilling host and an invisible observer. When they invited me to join their game, my skin prickled. I declined, saying I had work to do, but that only seemed to amuse them more. Their eyes glinted in the soft glow of the living room lamp, and every time they glanced my way, it felt as if they were sharing silent jokes I wasn't privy to, a joke at my expense. As night fell and I tried to tuck myself into bed, the sounds of their whispers drifted through the cracked walls of our old house. I could have sworn I heard my name amidst their giggles, calling me out as if it was a part of their secret game. The next day, I decided to take a bold step and talk to my husband, laying out my worries, hoping he would see the truth of the situation. "I just don't feel comfortable with them here, not with everything going on," I admitted, my heart racing as I spoke. He frowned, looking hurt, and I instantly regretted my honesty. "So you're saying our niece and her friends are a danger?" His voice was low and sharp like ice. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words felt too large for reality. He turned away, dismissing my fears as improbable paranoia. "You're overreacting," he said, and I knew that our disagreement would hang over us like a dark avalanche waiting to fall. Throughout the day, I became more determined to keep an eye on the children. I watched them from down the hall as they congregated around the dining room table, shadows flickering across their excited faces. They moved in coordinated precision, sharing odd words in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I stepped closer, they'd hush immediately, their eyes locking onto me with a strange intensity, as if I was intruding on something sacred. That night, I lay in bed, too restless to sleep, replaying my husband's skeptical reaction. Was I really being paranoid? The thought twisted my gut. I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing sensation lingering in my mind, but then a soft tapping snagged my attention. I swung my legs around and crept to the doorway. Peering into the darkened hallway, I felt the icy fingers of dread wrap around my spine. It was just past midnight, and the house was eerily silent except for the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the living room. Curiosity washed over me, enough to nudge my feet forward. I crept toward the voices, heart pounding, and when I reached the dining room, my heart nearly stopped. The children were gathered in a tight circle around something. What were they doing? I squinted, trying to see past their small, interlocked bodies. Suddenly, one of the boys glanced over his shoulder, catching my eye. An unsettling grin spread across his face, and he beckoned me closer. "Come join us," he chirped. Instinctively, I felt the air grow thick, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. "No," I called out, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" A round of giggles erupted, and the girl standing in the center lifted something high above her head, something glinting in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a stuffed animal, but it wasn't just any stuffed animal. Its fur was soaked, dripping an unnatural shade of red that pooled onto the floor. "Look!" another child exclaimed, excitedly pointing at the gory toy. "It's alive." My heart raced, and panic surged through my veins as I stumbled backward. They were all looking at me now, their expressions shifting from giddy playfulness to something dark, something twisted. The insistent tapping of their fists against the table echoed in the stillness, a morbid rhythm that sent chills shooting down my spine. "Wanna play?" the girl asked, her voice now too sweet, almost mocking. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door, pressing my back against it as if it could shield me from whatever vile magic those children possessed. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but in the morning, the unease returned tenfold. As the sun rose, I slammed coffee into my system and finally confronted my husband again. "You need to see what they're doing. They're playing with something." "Wrong." His eyes narrowed in disbelief, but before he could respond, a raucous series of knocks shattered the morning calm. The children were outside, slamming their palms against the door, yelling my name, their voices rising to a pitch that felt like nails scraping against my skull. I opened the door to reveal them standing in a line, beaming smiles painted across their faces like they were in on a joke I wasn't. "We want to play," they chanted in unison, their voices ringing like a nauseating choir. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and before I could reply, the boy in front pulled something from his pocket. It was a tattered piece of paper, and as he unfolded it, I recognized it all too well. "It's your name," he said, and my pulse quickened. It was an article written about the missing children of our town, my name marked at the bottom in a clumsy scrawl along with several others. "Join us in our secret, and you'll never want to leave," the girl chimed, and the invitation felt like a tether dragging me into an abyss. I slammed the door in their faces, trembling with anger and fear. My husband stormed in at that moment, demanding to know what was happening. I had never seen his face twisted with such concern. "Are you finally going to believe me?" I shouted, but he shook his head, his belief in me dwindling away like autumn leaves. I barricaded myself in our bedroom, praying, clutching my phone with trembling fingers, ready to call for help if it came to that, but I knew deep down that no one would believe me. The whispering began again, the shadows seemed to stretch further as I huddled against the closet door. Time blurred, and I didn't know how long I stayed there, locked in a never-ending spiral of fear, until I finally plucked up the courage to peek through the slightly ajar door. But the moment I did, an icy hand gripped my wrist, and those kids were there, back in my face, their smiles now wide and predatory, and they shifted like a sudden gust of wind as though they could melt right through the door. "You shouldn't have locked us out," the boy said, his voice echoing like distant thunder, and the last thing I remembered was screaming as the world crumbled into darkness around me, my consciousness slipping away as they slowly pulled me into their game. Ida for admitting I was uncomfortable. I now wondered, my voice echoing in the void, for there was no one left to hear me.
My son is a freshman in high school and frequently oversleeps, missing his bus, and I get so mad at him for this, but what unnerves me the most is what he says about his dreams. The strange, vivid nightmares that seem to linger even in the daylight hours, whispering through the cracks of our home. Just 3 weeks into the school year, he missed the bus for the second time, and I stormed into his room, ready to unleash the frustration I had been bottling up for too long. Yet, when I saw him there, tangled in his sheets, sweat glistening on his forehead, I felt a twist of concern wrap around my anger. "Don't you care about school? What's wrong with you?" I shouted, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He stirred, squinting at me, eyes clouded with a disoriented fear I didn't understand. "Mom," he replied in a whisper, "it's not the bus, it's the dreams." As he recounted them, my heart sank. He talked about a man in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, with fingers like spider legs that reached out towards him, scraping at his soul. I could see the fear pooling in his eyes, and while I wanted to dismiss it as typical teenage over-exaggeration, something in his voice made my skin prickle. The man, he said, was relentless, ushering in a collapsing world where echoes of forgotten monstrosities taunted him in twisted reflections of our home. I brushed off his fears, thinking it was just stress from the transition to high school, but over the next few weeks, my son continued to oversleep, and his grades started slipping. Even worse, he would wander through our house in a daze, mumbling about the man with the long fingers and how he could feel him pulling him back into the dream, weaving a darkness around him that was starting to invade our waking life. I tried grounding him, taking away his phone, and even seeking advice from a doctor, but nothing changed. Then one night, just after he'd missed yet another bus, I heard noises coming from his room, like muffled cries or soft thuds, and I hesitated before knocking. When I finally twisted the knob and opened the door, I was met with an unsettling sight. He was standing in the middle of his room, eyes closed, face contorted in fear, his hands waving about as if he were fighting something unseen. "Get out!" he screamed suddenly, and I took a step back, my stomach dropping as I realized he wasn't talking to me. "He's right behind you!" he shrieked, and I felt the air grow thick with an almost palpable dread. I hesitated, caught between instinct and terror, and before I could make a move, he collapsed, silencing the room. Terrified, I rushed to him, checking for a pulse, trying to ground him in reality as I called for help into the nothingness. Days turned into weeks, his mind becoming a battlefield between wakefulness and haunted dreams, each night more harrowing than the last, all while I helplessly watched my son slip away. I devised a plan, thinking perhaps if he faced the man in his dreams, it would empower him. Little did I know how wrong that would go. That night, I placed a recorder next to his bed, hoping to capture his nightmares for us to dissect together in daylight, convinced that knowledge would shed light on the darkness. But instead of clarity, I heard the chilling entities spill from his lips as he slept, words too dark to understand, curses and urgent warnings about the dangers of dreams should one dare to cross the threshold. When I listened back, I felt an uncanny presence wash over me, squeezing at my heart as the screeching rasp of the man echoed in the night. Each morning, I would find him deeper in the clutches of those twisted dreams, with fewer and fewer lucid moments, and that's when I began to see the changes in the house, shadows darting just beyond the corner of my vision, items displaced, and the feeling of something waiting just outside our realm. I finally sought comfort from a local folklore expert who spoke of dream realms and entities that fed off fears, suggesting a ritual to release my son from the grip of this dream taker. With reluctance but desperate hope, I followed her instructions. I lit candles, burned sage, and called his spirit to fight back while he slept. Just as I finished, a sound broke the silence, a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down my spine. I ran to his room, finding it empty, the only evidence of his presence being the broken recorder splayed in pieces on the floor, and that's when I noticed the dark figure standing in the doorway, the skin stretched tight against the bone, fingers long and twisting like branches reaching for answers. Heart racing, I shouted for my son, but the entity only stepped closer, its breath foul, filled with whispers that clawed at my sanity. I felt a surge of parental instinct and lunged forward, but it was almost a tangible wall of darkness that forced me back, planting me against the wall, breath stolen, watching helplessly as two blank holes stared straight through me. I finally found my voice, realizing in desperation that the man hadn't just been a dream, he was here, binding my son in chains forged from nightmares. Just as hope dimmed, a figure erupted into the room, my son's voice charging back from the depths. He chanted words I didn't recognize but felt powerful, and with every syllable, the atmosphere shifted, the figure recoiled, screeching as it faded back into the shadows. And then silence. My son collapsed again, this time still, and I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him more to hold on to sanity than comfort. After a moment, he stirred, groggy but present, and when he opened his eyes, there was something darker lurking beneath. He didn't speak of the dream or the figure or what had truly happened, he only murmured, "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I brushed the guilt away, wanting to assure him it would be alright, but the distance in his gaze spoke volumes about what we had unleashed and lost. I soon discovered that my son wasn't the only one waking up each day with shadows lingering just behind his eyes. As days turned bittersweet, I realized the man might not let us go so easily, and I learned that every morning when I wake him up for school, I'm battling more than just his reluctance to rise. I'm battling the silence in my home that grows heavier with each sunset, and the chilling realization that my son's freshman year might turn out to be not just the beginning of adolescence, but rather, a descent into a nightmare from which we may never truly awaken.
Ida for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent. It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop, an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know." When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. "I heard you don't want to meet me." "That's okay, I understand your feelings." It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind, Ida for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us.
I never thought that lying about my job would come back to haunt me, but here I am, covered in sweat and fear, trying to figure out how it spiraled so far out of control. It all started when I met Lisa at a housewarming party. She was stunning, the kind of woman who seemed to radiate a light all her own, her laughter infectious. I desperately wanted her to notice me, to see me as someone worth her time, so when she asked what I did for a living, I panicked and blurted out that I was a historical data analyst specializing in archaic technologies. The look on her face was priceless. She was impressed, and I reveled in the attention, my charade becoming a thrilling game as I watched her interest in me grow, but I was treading on dangerous ground. The next week, she asked me to meet at a local cafe where she wanted to introduce me to her friend, a history professor who taught ancient civilizations, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There was no way I could back out of this now, so I just lied through my teeth, casually dropping technical jargon as if I lived and breathed it. To my immense shock, they seemed to truly buy it, and just like that, I was pulled deeper into my own web of deception. The more we hung out, the more I had to fabricate, conjuring elaborate stories about my research trips to ancient ruins that only existed in my imagination. I felt an exhilarating high, but it was laced with a creeping dread. Then came the day I received a text from Lisa asking if I'd help her organize a panel discussion at her university. Her professor friend thought I'd be a perfect guest speaker. My heart raced in panic, but I could hardly say no without crashing the entire facade I'd built. I spent the next few sleepless nights researching historical terms and facts, preparing myself for the inevitable moment I had to stand in front of a crowd and pretend to be someone I wasn't. When the day arrived, I walked into the auditorium, adrenaline pumping, eyes darting nervously. There were dozens of students seated, and I could see Elisa beaming with pride. It was time to act. I stood at the podium, the microphone in front of me feeling like a noose tightening around my throat. I began speaking, weaving a tapestry of lies so intricate that, for a moment, I almost believed my own junk. Each compliment, each nod of understanding from the audience made me feel invincible, but behind the facade, the tendrils of anxiety were wrapping around my heart tighter with every passing moment. Just as I was almost in the groove of my false narrative, a hand shot up in the back, and I was met with the icy glare of a stern-looking man who introduced himself as Dr. Palmer, a leading archaeologist with a sharp reputation for debunking frauds, and my blood ran cold as he asked me to clarify a term I had just used. In that moment, I was frozen, words escaped me, and I realized that I had stepped into a pit filled with alligators, and even though I had the instincts to claw my way out, I didn't even know which way to turn. Dr. Palmer leaned in, pressing me further, the students around me shifting in their seats, the tension palpable, and just when I thought I might implode, Lisa spoke up, trying to rescue me with her charm, battling the aggressive barrage of questions, but my heart sank as I realized I was dragging her into my lie, too. I felt sick, knowing I had thrust her into the chaos of my deception, and just as I considered the possibility of simply fleeing the stage, the fire alarm unexpectedly blared, sending everyone into a panic. It was a chaotic cocktail of relief and dread, making my heart pound as we were ushered outside. But instead of escaping, I found myself cornered by Dr. Palmer, who pulled me aside and whispered fierce accusations of dishonesty and ignorance. With sweat trickling down my neck, I braced myself for the storm, and before I could muster any form of plausible denial, he leaned in closer and said something that turned my world inside out. "You think you're the first? They're watching." My eyes widened in confusion, and before I could ask who he meant, he pulled back to survey the crowd flooding the campus grounds. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart dropped into my stomach as I caught sight of a group of people in dark coats, standing ominously beneath an ancient oak tree, their eyes fixed on me. They looked like something out of a nightmare, long faces, expressions twisted with dark amusement, and with each person I recognized, my throat grew tighter. They were a group connected to the very archaic technology I had only pretended to know about. Fear flashed through me as I realized I hadn't just fabricated a job, I'd caught the attention of something much darker, something that existed outside the bounds of reality as I knew it. My mind raced with panic as the crowd began to disperse, but something about those people lingered, like shadows that wouldn't fade. I knew I had to disappear, to run from this tangled web of lies before it swallowed me whole, but running meant abandoning Lisa, who deserved someone real, someone good in her life, rather than the ghost of a man woven from lies. And before I knew what I was doing, I took off into the night, knowing full well that my fabricated job, once a ticket to her heart, had become a doorway to a haunting I never signed up for, and as I sprinted away, I could still feel those eyes watching me, hungry for the truth. I thought I could escape, but every night since, every time I glance over my shoulder, I feel them lurking, their whispers echoing in the recesses of my mind, a reminder of the twisted game I played, the moment when I took a leap into a world of darkness, and instead of letting go, it gripped tighter, until I can no longer tell the difference between who I was, who I pretended to be, and what terrible price I will eventually pay, haunted not just by my choices, but by the very shadows of the lives I so carelessly constructed and tore apart in an effort to find love. For the last 10 years, I've built my life on the shaky foundation of my own lies, convinced that gaslighting myself was the only way to survive the sprawling darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. It all began with a fleeting thought on a cold autumn night, the trees swaying like dark sentinels outside my window, whispering secrets of truths I didn't want to hear, and somewhere in that chill, a desire stirred within me to rewrite the narrative of my existence, to take control of my reality by crafting an alternate version of myself, a version that everyone around me would believe, and in return, I crafted self-assurances like a repeated prayer. convincing not just myself but also my friends and family that I was always the life of the party, the optimist who sought silver linings in every struggle. But deep down, I felt like a ghost drifting through a waking nightmare, losing grasp on the boundaries between what was real and what was just a figment of my anxiety, a haze of denial obscuring all. I spun tales of grandeur where I was a successful artist, eluding the truth that I spent my days working in a dull office, covering my fragile self with the vivid pigments of my imagined life, a life where people respected me, loved me, and saw something worthy. The years dissolved into a blur as I meticulously crafted a web of half-truths and delusions, convincing those I cared about, and eventually even myself, that my canvas was full of brilliant strokes, but inside, the colors muddied, pulling me into a relentless cycle of fear and deception. As I smiled through the facade at birthday parties and family gatherings, laughing when I should have been crying, skills I mastered over time, each mask more polished with layers of deceit, while at night, I'd stare at the ceiling, the silence enveloping me like a thick fog as I searched for the truth buried deep beneath my make-believe, whispering to myself how it was too late to turn back, far too late to reveal the cracks in my shimmering disguise. My sister Sarah, bless her heart, always believed my tales. Her bright eyes reflecting the confidence I had instilled in her. She would often talk about my upcoming art show, a grand event I fabricated, and I just kept letting those lies spill from my lips, watching her excitement bloom. But with each passing day, I felt the weight of my lies like boulders resting on my chest, suffocating me. Things spiraled out of control when I fell for someone truly remarkable, Jared, with his golden laughter and boundless talent. A man whose light illuminated the corners of my own darkness. I wanted so desperately to share my life with him, to let him see the real me, but all I managed to do was trap him in my web, feeding him scraps of reality while withholding the bitter truth of my existence. My genuine self was hidden beneath layers of betrayal to my own spirit. Over coffee dates and twilight walks, I showcased elaborately fabricated stories of success, sidestepping the reality of a girl paralyzed by her own fears. Yet the more I cloaked myself in this idealized version, the more I realized I loathed who I had become, a hollow echo in the din of my own creation. It was ultimately our year anniversary that broke me, a beautifully wrapped gift waiting for me at my doorstep with my name scrawled across it in Jared's spindly handwriting. My heart raced as I tore off the paper, revealing a book titled The Art of Being Real, a journal filled with notes, sketches, and reflections, the blank pages blanketing his hopes for our future. It felt like a physical manifestation of everything I couldn't be, and just like that, the gilded facade collapsed in my chest, dust and shadows swirling around me. I thought I could maintain the illusion, that I could gaslight my own heart into believing in me, but the reality was crashing in like an unforgiving tide, every whisper of "you'll never be good enough" crashing against the fortress I built. Panic ripped through me, and I confronted Jared, my breath coming in shallow bursts, begging for a way to escape the spiraling waves of truth. I fought against the revelations that screamed louder than my lies. "I'm not who you think I am," I cried, watching confusion flash in his eyes, the kind eyes that once sparkled with sincerity now clouded over with an unrecognizable mix of concern and disappointment. All peace crumbled as I revealed the hollow Manning behind the curtain, cracking under the pressure of fabrications, and the panic over losing him became an all-consuming fire. My mind twisted into a frenzy, sending me deeper into the abyss until that moment came. A glimmer of clarity illuminating an unshakable truth. The people I'd gaslit would always be able to see through my layers of deception eventually, and the only way to save anyone was to finally own my brokenness, to peel off the layers that seemed to protect but actually chained me down. I thought I was protecting everyone else, living my life in a delusional bubble, but I had only imprisoned myself in a world of distortions, and it was then, while drenched in tears and shattered confessions, that I irrevocably changed the story I'd been telling not just Jared but everyone. Hoping against hope that they would understand and not view me as just a mindless liar but as a flawed human being striving for authenticity. But as Jared looked away, searching for the right words, I realized that sometimes the truth hurts worse than any lie, and despite pouring my heart out, the space that once vibrated with love felt colder, an echo of all the things I'd concealed crashing around me, and as silence draped around us like a thick fog, I feared that maybe this time, I really had lost it all.
I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since. I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out. Her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car. Toad, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare?
I'm lying to everyone I've ever known and ever will meet, and it all spirals back to that one fateful night when thunder cracked the sky like a gunshot, and I found myself standing before a figure so grotesque that I still can't shake the image from my consciousness. The storm had begun rolling in, heavy and brooding, as I drove down an old country road, my only company the flickering glow of my headlights against the encroaching darkness that enveloped the landscape like a suffocating shroud. I just left a party, feeling the stirrings of the usual ennui that filled the moments before I could slip beneath the sheets of my quiet, nondescript life, when I saw her, really, on the side of the road. The creature looked like a woman at first, slim and unkempt, drenched by the torrential downpour, but as I slowed to a stop to offer her a ride, I realized how wrong I was. The moment she stepped forward, her face, pale and covered in dark, matted hair, illuminated by the car's headlights, revealed deep-set eyes that glistened with an unnatural hunger, a maw that opened far too wide, exposing rows of jagged teeth that churned with drool. The slam of my heart echoed in my ears as she raised a hand, finger outstretched, beckoning me closer, her voice a haunting croak that promised secrets and darkness, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an instinct that screamed for me to run, and yet, there was something alluring about her, a draw that pulled me closer as if I was entranced. I didn't know what compelled me, whether it was curiosity or sheer madness, but I've never regretted anything in my life as deeply as the choice to roll down my window and ask if she needed help. Her eyes lit up with a ravenous glint, and she climbed inside without permission, barely taking note of my presence, her breath a swirling mass of decay. And then, she whispered my name, the name I had never told her, a name buried deep within my darkest memories. I should have turned around, should have thrown myself out of the moving car, but instead, I felt a thrill of fear intertwine with a sick fascination as I realized she knew everything, the lies I'd spun to weave a perfect life, the secrets I'd taken to my grave. For weeks, I had been pretending to be someone I wasn't, a dutiful brother, a dedicated employee, a caring boyfriend, all roles draped on the flimsy fabric of my identity to mask the truth that I had abandoned the innocent boy who once aspired to become someone real, relegated instead to a phantom version of myself, run by the whims of a twisted psyche. As she leaned closer, her fetid scent filling the car, she unraveled the truth of who I was beneath the surface, layers of lies peeled back until I felt completely exposed, raw and quivering in her gaze. I couldn't bear it, the flood of shame consuming me as she smiled, revealing more of those jagged teeth, and I understood, with a chilling clarity, that she meant to take everything from me, not just my feeble attempts to create a life worth living, but my very soul. In that moment, I knew I had to escape. It wasn't just about my false persona anymore, she was hungry for something far darker than mere secrets, and I wasn't sure if I could outrun whatever she intended to devour. In a wild burst of adrenaline, I sped away into the enveloping night, my heart racing as her laughter echoed like the thunder clapping overhead, mocking my very existence. No one would ever know what I had seen, what I had done, how close I had come to being consumed by the truth of my own deceit, and that thought clenched at my insides as I sliced through the rain, determined to bury the darkness born of that encounter. But the fabric of my life began to unravel, even in the safety of my own home. I could feel her presence, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering insinuations that gnawed away at the stability I'd so meticulously constructed. I would sit with friends, the laughter echoing against the walls, and I would play my part, the charming facade firmly in place, but every grin felt like a mask clashing against the tightness in my chest, where the truth festered. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of my duplicity strangled me, creeping into every interaction, every conversation. I was convinced that if I looked in the mirror hard enough, I'd find her standing just behind me, waiting for an opportunity to drag me back into that void of darkness. In moments of solitude, I would hear her crooning my name, and I was tormented by dreams of her where I'd wake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath as her laughter slithered around my consciousness. I became a prisoner to my own fear, forged by one harrowing encounter, and soon, the lies I told others transformed into lies I told myself, feeding the endless cycle of madness. I told my brother I was fine when, in truth, I felt like a ghost in my own skin. I spun elaborate tales to my girlfriend about work, decorating them with half-truths and glossing over the gnawing unease that hollered at me from inside my chest. Even when they'd look at me, their eyes filled with trust and affection, I couldn't share the suffocating truth that tainted my every breath, so I became a collector of secrets, lost in a labyrinth of my own design. The lies were easy, everyone loves a good story, the thrill of truth tinged with fantasy, But the suffocating darkness of my thousand-layered deceit began to compound until it felt as though a noose had tightened around my throat, squeezing until I thought I would choke. I feared the moment when the fiction I'd created would become a reality, but more than that, I feared her coming back, hungry for what she believed I owed her because, somewhere in my heart, I knew she would return. And then one day, as I sat in my car at a red light, plagued by the jagged shards of my own conscience, I turned to look out the passenger's window, and there she was, standing in the pouring rain, her hair matted against her skin, peeling lips stretching into a skull-cracking grin that twisted the knife of fear deep into my gut. The pulse of adrenaline thrummed like an unholy ritual, and I slammed the gear into drive, heart hammering as I sped through the intersection, defined by panic and dread, but the weight of guilt and the thought that she was waiting for the outcome of my selfish games gnawed at me relentlessly. I'm lying to everyone I've ever known and ever will meet, and I don't know how to escape the noose that binds me to her grim fate, this unholy link forged in truth and shadows, and I realize with a sickening clarity that the moment our paths entwined, my life was never mine to control again. The lies ripple outward, they morph, taking root in every soul I've touched, until I'm standing at the precipice of a truth I can no longer swallow, her promises echoing in the silence behind me. I'm afraid that one day, all these lies will come crashing down like a storm, and I will find myself in the very void I tried to escape, where she waits, ready to collect her due.
When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo? She said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear, she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal, Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love.
It had been over a year since I first stepped into Dr. Harris's office, a nondescript little place tucked away in a crumbling brick building that smelled faintly of old coffee and faded hope, and though I had started seeing him for depression, I thought we were making real progress, until the day my treatment took an absurd turn that sent me spiraling into a nightmare. It was an unassuming Tuesday afternoon when I entered his office for what I thought was just another appointment, but something felt off. Dr. Harris looked at me as though I were a complete stranger, his eyes narrowing skeptically at the familiar face before him. I cleared my throat, trying to mask my unease as I sensed a clinical detachment in his demeanor, one reserved for patients he'd never seen before, and when I reminded him of my history, a flicker of confusion crossed his brow, hinting that perhaps I was just a blip in his memory, just another patient lost in a sea of faces, emotions, and diagnoses. Then came the moment that shattered whatever trust I had left. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and, with an unsettling calm, offered me a small bag with a white powder inside, a gesture that hung in the air like a bad joke. "This might help," he said, a lopsided grin twisting his lips, and I stared at him, caught between disbelief and shock as I searched his eyes for the slightest hint of humor, only to find a vacant smile staring back at me. "You know, for the pain," he continued, and my heart raced as I tried to process how my psychiatrist, the man I had turned to for help, was not only failing to recognize me but was also suggesting I self-medicate with cocaine, a drug I had only ever read about in sensational headlines. Frantic thoughts hurtled through my mind, wondering if I hadn't just stumbled into a surreal alternate reality, and I began fumbling for my phone, wondering how quickly I could escape this twisted scene. But before I could gather myself, Dr. Harris leaned closer, eyes glimmering with an intensity that sent an icy shiver down my spine. "You want to forget, don't you?" he said, voice low, smooth as silk yet laced with a sinister undertone, and the tainted air in that dim room felt somehow alive, as if it were holding secrets I was never meant to uncover. At that moment, I was no longer just a patient, I was a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator, And the walls that once felt safe now seemed to close in on me, warping the air with an oppressive weight. He continued pushing the bag toward me, his once comforting presence now twisted into something grotesque, and I was overwhelmed with a growing sense of horror as I envisioned the desperate things that could emerge from the shadows of his mind. I stumbled back, shaking my head, desperate to escape the bizarre confrontation, but deep down, a voice whispered that I couldn't leave just yet. Instead, I managed to sputter out a refusal, insisting that I was not looking to forget, but to heal, only. To watch as that crooked grin faltered briefly before he recoiled, an eerie smile returning that made my skin crawl. "Healing is overrated," he retorted, the light in his eyes dimming as the clinical facade slipped away, revealing something darker, something feral lurking beneath his polished exterior. I turned to leave, the weight of his stare pressing cruelly against my back, but as my hand gripped the door, I hesitated, my mind racing with the implications of his actions. Did he truly not remember me? Or was this some perverse game meant to test my resolve? My pulse quickened as I considered all the therapies we had tried together, sessions spent bearing my soul, unraveling years of bottled pain and bitterness, and here he was, offering an escape into a world where sanity seemed a mere afterthought. If he didn't recognize me, did that mean I was just another unfinished puzzle he'd cast aside? Half-asleep dreams of self-destruction danced at the edges of my vision, and I found my mind racing, contemplating medicine's darker manifestations, the therapists who had crossed ethical lines, their boundaries forever lost in their pursuit of some twisted truth. I shook my head again, pleading for clarity, but Dr. Harris simply leaned back and waved a dismissive hand, as if to erase my protests without so much as a thought. "You think too much. Sometimes you have to dive in to understand the waters," he mused, and in that moment, a sliver of primal fear opened inside me. This was not the man I once trusted, and I took my chance to bolt from that room, or so I thought. As I reached for the handle, a sudden wave crashed over me, my sanity felt fragile as I crossed into the unknown, and the lingering offer of a hollow escape clung to my thoughts like a phantom. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping as reality collided with surreality, and panic set in. Others wandered through the building, blissfully unaware of the darkness threaded in their own therapy stories. I half convinced myself to call the authorities, raging against what I'd just experienced, but as I reached for my phone, I realized I had left it behind in the grim office, the final tether to my sense of reality now adrift in his haunted space. I took off running down the staircase 2 steps at a time, every footfall a reminder that I had shared my deepest fears with a man who no longer seemed human. Doubts flooded my mind as I questioned my own memories. Did I dream our sessions? Was it all in my head? I burst through the main door and into the gray afternoon, needing the clarity of fresh air against my fevered skin, but as the light stabbed my eyes, I felt as if a darkness had seeped into the world around me. I stumbled through the city, my senses heightened, scanning faces for any sign of familiarity, my heart pervaded by a relentless dread that seemed to echo what Dr. Harris had said. I wanted to forget. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety, the question of whether I should trust the memories, flooding my mind overshadowed by the cacophony of thoughts. As the sun began to set, the once bustling streets felt increasingly deserted. The fear coiled tighter as shadows took on an unnerving form, each misplaced glance and whispered inquiry amplifying the turmoil swirling in my gut. By nightfall, paranoia clawed at me, intertwining with the remnants of hope. I turned to the only option left, the one place where I figured people still believed in the shared connection of healing. I made my way, each footfall echoing with the remnants of that encounter, past the neon signs of bars and restaurants filled with laughter that felt alien to my sinking heart. I finally reached my friend Jenna's apartment, a refuge from my descent into madness, and as I knocked, desperation clawed at my throat. The door creaked open, and I was met with her warm smile, the flickering light behind her casting a gentle glow around her like a guardian angel. As I poured out my harrowing experience, the comfort of her presence began to wash over me, bolstering my resolve. Jenna listened intently, her brows furrowing with concern as my words spilled forth, and she pulled me closer, assuring me I was safe. But as I began to settle, trying to shake the terror of Dr. Harris's dismissal, I suddenly felt the weight of her gaze change, a flicker of recognition passing over her features and then a shadow of uncertainty creeping in. "He didn't offer you anything, did he?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with an edge I savored too late. A sickening realization pulled in my stomach, and I knew then that Dr. Harris wasn't just losing memories, he was losing his grip. As that truth settled deep within me, I could feel the walls of my fragile sanity thin in the wake of what my mind could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare, leaving me suspended in a limbo where fear became my only friend, and the shadows I had once escaped could now hold my darkest truths. For more years than I care to admit, I've been silently battling a personal demon, a relentless obsession with alcohol that began when I was just a teenager, mingling with the wrong crowd at parties, pretending I was invincible, floating on the high of spirits that distorted my reality and twisted my perception of relationships. It became a crutch I leaned on too heavily, the nights blurring together under a haze of slippery memories, regret filling the spaces between the laughter of friends. As I grew older, I found myself slipping deeper into the abyss. Friends were lost, bruised relationships shattered under the weight of my dependency, until I finally made a choice. I resolved to quit. But quitting meant facing the world, social situations, and an annoying sense of isolation without my beloved poison, so I hatched a plan, a disguise I thought could veil my recovery from the people I still drank with. Instead of ordering a vodka soda or whiskey neat, I'd simply request water, the ultimate sleight of hand, while carrying on conversations as if nothing had changed. Gradually, it became second nature. I would show up at bars or parties, a water bottle in my hand, and no one suspected a thing. They laughed, they toasted, and I felt glimmers of pride that I was keeping my promise to myself, all while appearing comfortable, even social. But the weight of my secret piled onto my chest like boulders on a bridge, threatening to crush me at every turn. But the truth is, I didn't just stop drinking alcohol, I started replacing it with something much darker. As weeks turned into months, my friends grew accustomed to the sight of my water bottle, chuckling at my new healthy lifestyle and dismissing my absence from the bottom of bottles with playful nudges. What they didn't realize was that with each sip of water, I was filling the gaps in my life with something far more sinister. I became increasingly obsessed with eavesdropping on conversations, reading lives like books, each toast and laugh amplifying the echoes of my own misery. I'd watch their eyes light up when they let loose, not realizing I had started a different kind of addiction, one to their secrets, to the imprints of their realities painted out in blurred half-truths as they spiraled into drunkenness. The stories spilled so easily in the late-night hours, revelations that flowed as freely as the alcohol, and as I swirled my water bottle contemplatively, I began cataloging not just their stories, but their vulnerabilities, the partner who cheated, the dream job they lost, the hidden traumas nestled deep in their pasts, becoming a twisted curator of their souls. It thrilled me at first, a sense of power over them that soothed the frayed edges of my own self-worth, but with power came consequences. As the night wore on and lanterns flickered in smoke-filled rooms, I noticed strange changes, sometimes in their eyes, a flickering recognition that felt unsettling, as if they could peer through my facade and glimpse the voyeuristic intrigues that had taken root in my heart. How, I wondered, could they possibly detect the predator behind the charming mask? Then came that fateful night at Sam's birthday party. The music thumped like a pulse and the room crackled with laughter. I sat in the corner, nursing my familiar water, continuing to observe and record little pieces of their lives, when I overheard the unmistakable sound of tears mingled with laughter. It was Sarah, the quietest one of the group, confiding in Mark about her abusive ex, her words ragged and raw. Something shifted inside of me, a need to protect her bloomed, tangled with the roots of my own pain and the desperate urge to drown my loneliness in her vulnerability. As the evening progressed, I approached Sarah under the guise of offering her a refill, my heart racing before I even spoke. "Hey, you okay?" I gestured towards the slightly crumpled paper cup in her hands, the one that had been tightly cradled, trembling under the weight of emotions she struggled to articulate. Suddenly, it felt different, a line crossed. This wasn't just eavesdropping anymore, it was involvement. Yet, part of me relished it. I wasn't just an observer, I was now a participant in their stories. I watched her face as I comforted her, listening intently, but in the corners of my mind, paranoia took hold, whispering that my own secrets were just beneath the surface, a dark veil that threatened to slip. Later, as I shifted back to my half-empty bottle, the air hung heavy with unwelcome tension. I noticed Mark watching me, his expression darkening. "You're not drinking, right?" He chuckled, but there was something wrong in his tone, something chilling that sent a shiver dancing up my spine. I laughed it off, but I could feel a chill radiating from his gaze, as if he knew I was collecting pieces of them, feeding off their brokenness. It spiraled at night, as I faced the music of their trust, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom thrumming beneath my skin. I heard fragments of whispers and felt eyes linger on me, unsettling and accusing, piercing my protective facade. In the blink of an eye, the mood shifted. Sarah had a drink too many, her laughter turned into a sobbing fit, hurling her truths into the void, all while I collected secrets overflowing like the alcohol we had danced around. I watched in horror as from the corner of my eye, Mark grabbed me, pulling me away from the group, his grip iron around my wrist. "You need to stop hiding, man," he muttered as I protested, an edge of urgency slicing into his words. "What do you mean?" My stomach notched at his accusation. "You, with your water, we all see it. You think you're clever, but you're just preying on our pain." The words hit harder than any bottle ever had, the whispers in my head erupted into a cacophony. My heart raced as I realized the damning truth, that I had been so focused on their vulnerabilities that I had failed to acknowledge my own rotting core. I fumbled for words, desperate to defend myself, but with every denial, the weight of guilt pushed me deeper into the shadows of my own making. That night unraveled like a thread pulled too tight, the very connections I'd thought I'd forged now fraying. I couldn't look Sarah in the eyes anymore, nor face the interrogative glare of Mark. I felt their betrayal slicing through my very soul, stripping away any remaining threads of trust that bound us together. Before I knew it, my facade collapsed under the weight of their accusations, and with it, my morale sunk like a stone, slipping away into the darkness I had been so desperate to escape. I fled that night, leaving behind the cacophony of laughter and tears, the curious glances of friends who thought they knew me but had barely scratched the surface of my unraveling. And in the days that followed, their calls blurred into distant echoes, and as silence enveloped me, the weight of isolation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I spiraled down, losing myself once again to the quiet allure of forgetting, this time cloaked in shame. I started injecting my life with substances even more damaging than the alcohol I had sworn off, seeking solace but finding only further despair. Days became weeks, and then nothing but a blur laden with regret until the memory of that party felt like a phantom, a distant storm I thought I could escape from. But now, as I write this, I realize I can't outrun the truth I buried so deep, the trust I shattered. It haunts me with every sip of water, taunts me with every casual encounter, a remnant of the life I constructed on whispers. I watch the world through the glass of the bottles I long to touch, while the voices of my friends murmur in the back of my mind. I didn't just swap whiskey for water, I swapped connection for isolation, pouring my life down the drain, laughing at the fragility of their truths that I hoarded like trophies. And now, as I sit alone in this unending abyss, I wonder what has become of the friends I abandoned, their stories still swirling somewhere in the ether, while I drown in the most intoxicating truth of all, the one haunting me day by agonizing day, that I destroyed the only good connections I had in favor of manipulating their pain. When I was a teenager, I stumbled into the world of chat lines, those late-night calls where strangers shared their darkest secrets and desires, a playground of anonymity where I could pretend to be anyone I wanted. I even played the role of an underage girl, feigning innocence, letting the sounds of men's voices wash over me, enticing whispers that pulled me into a web of deception I thought I could control. But it got out of hand one fateful night when I found myself on the line with a man whose voice dripped with unsettling charm. Claiming to be a fatherly figure who understood my struggles, I caught a thrill when he said he could save me from my lonely existence. An odd sense of comfort wrapped itself around me as I played along, feeding him bits of my fabricated life while ignoring the red flags waving frantically in the back of my mind. He wanted to meet, and with each escalating thrill, a twist pulled tighter in my gut. A sensation I ignored as I stirred deeper into this dark fantasy, thinking I was just playing a game, but I agreed, my heart pounding and not just from thrill but terror that began to stir when he told me he knew where I lived. I laughed it off, insisting he was bluffing, but he calmly replied, "You think I can't find you? Just keep talking, and I'll show you what I can do." And with that, the playful charade turned sinister, twisting my thoughts, burying my bravado under the weight of an undeniable fear that blossomed like a dark flower, blackening the innocence I thought I was preserving, recalling every creepy detail from the stories I'd heard about girls who foolishly put themselves in harm's way. The clock ticked, my heart raced, and I began to question every choice I had ever made in my reckless pursuit of attention. I said nothing, becoming a silent statue on the line, waiting for his voice to call again, praying this was all a sick joke, but returning calls echoed against the walls of my mind, escalating the dread I felt. Out of desperation, I hung up and buried myself in distraction, scrolling through social media, hoping to shove this experience into a far corner of my mind, telling myself I was safe, I was clever. But days turned into weeks and that thrill turned into a haunting echo that deepened my growing sense of paranoia. Then, one ominous evening as I walked home from my friend's house, feeling the chill of dusk settling in, I heard it, the low inflection of a voice crackling through the air, murky and familiar, causing an icy shiver that crawled through my spine, making every hair on my body stand at attention. It mirrored the tones of my late-night conversations, threading its way through the dark like a living shadow chasing me. I turned to find nothing but an empty street, until I saw it, a figure lurking at a distance, draped in the twilight shadows, The heart in my chest thudded violently as the reality of just how vulnerable I had made myself settled in. That feeling of being followed clamped down on me tight as I tried to convince myself I was simply being foolish, but I couldn't shake the urge to turn around, to observe as I began walking briskly, my instincts screaming at me to run. When I reached my doorstep, I slammed the door shut, leaned against it, gasping for breath, and the brief sense of security washed over me, yet I couldn't calm the raging storm inside. My cell phone buzzed unexpectedly in my pocket, and when I fished it out, there it was, a message from a blocked number reading simply, "You shouldn't play games you can't win." And in that moment, the laughter of my youthful naivety turned to ash in my mouth as pure dread settled over me, swirling into my consciousness. I realized how foolish I was to think I could dance on the edge without ever falling, and with trembling hands, I deleted my account and swore never to return to those lines again. But what I thought was the end of this dark chapter was just the beginning. Because the next morning, the familiar creep of dread sank its claws deeper into my gut when I found handwritten notes slipped under my door, with details only I would know, recounting snippets of my life that should have remained private, my school, my friends, the secrets I shared with no one. The notes continued for weeks, growing more intense, more threatening, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was the product of overactive imagination, my gut growled with a chilling certainty that someone was watching, waiting, calculating. I turned to the police, who looked at me as if I were just another teenager seeking attention, and despair enveloped me until one night, I finally snapped. I decided to confront my shadow. I sent a text from a fake number, filled with passive aggression, taunting this phantom that haunted my steps, asking who they were, as if I could somehow lure a response and unveil my stalker's identity. It worked, fueling the fire inside the heart of this unknown monster, because within hours I received a reply, chilling yet captivating, a single word, "soon." And in an instant, a sizzling temperature ignited in my chest, coursing through my veins, fear morphing into an insatiable thrill. I stood outside on my porch, dialed that chat line number one last time, my breath hitching as the call connected, and while my pulse raced in excitement, the voice that slithered through the phone sent shivers down my spine. It was him, the man I had spoken to all those years ago, and he asked me if I had enjoyed our little game, if I liked the new rules. I didn't know if this was a nightmare or if I was going completely insane, but when faced with the cold reality that the monster I had invited into my life was very real and breathing just outside my window, each breath pressed against my throat, a new level of terror emerged within me, blending seamlessly into the darkness of the laugh echoing back at me through the receiver. A sound so utterly bone-chilling that I realized too late, some games can indeed be played to the end, but the stakes may be far more than you bargained for. Each turn pushing the boundaries of survival and sanity at the same time, casting shadows where once there had only been a fleeting thrill, only for me to discover that the deeper you dive into someone else's darkness, the more your own shadows come to haunt you.